As the member quite rightly says, farmers have a huge contribution both to the economic growth of this country and to our food security, and that is why we are absolutely determined to work hand in hand with Welsh Government to ensure that we can offer the very best to our Welsh farmers.
Sir Ashley Fox.
Question number 8.
Minister.
Thank you. Nuclear energy can play an important role in helping to achieve energy security and clean power, whilst providing thousands of skilled jobs. Great British Nuclear has acquired the Wilver site with a view to developing a new nuclear project. Decisions on the project and the technologies to be deployed at Wilver will be made in due course.
Ashley Fox.
Mr. Speaker, the last government announced the biggest expansion in nuclear power for 70 years, including the commissioning of Hinkley Point C in Somerset. Does the Minister agree that a new nuclear power plant at Wilver is vital to the UK's energy security, and can she give a timeline for its development?
Minister.
As a previously designated nuclear site that has hosted nuclear power, Wilver is ideally placed either to be used for large-scale nuclear or indeed to be used for a series of small modular reactors. And we will be setting out our plans on the site in due course.
David Chadwick.
Question number 11, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
This government is committed to improving digital connectivity, as demonstrated by our commitment to full gigabit and national 5G coverage by 2030. I've recently met internet and mobile providers as well as Ofcom. The honourable member will be aware that thanks to the UK Government's shared rural network, 4G connectivity has been boosted in his own constituency as a result of the activation last month of 2 additional masts.
David Chadwick.
Many of my constituents living in areas like Llanyrthel and Carnarvon Fawr have been missed out by previous rollout schemes. Is the government committed to ensuring that funding is available to ensure that people living in so-called hard-to-reach areas can be connected?
Well, I very much appreciate the concern that the honourable member has for his constituents, particularly in a rural area which has so many challenges for connectivity. What I can tell him is that in his constituency, over 90% of the premises can access superfast broadband speeds, and to extend gigabit capable coverage further, approximately 3,000 premises in his constituency are currently expected to receive gigabit capable connection through Project Gigabit cross-regional procurement framework, and alongside this there are 21 voucher projects across the constituency which include approximately 5,000 premises. But if he concerns, perhaps he could come and see me on the matter.
Jerome Mayo.
Number 13.
Thanks. Jerome Mayo.
Number 13.
Secretary of State, I presume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We recognise that the NHS in Wales faces unique challenges and are committed to working closely with the Welsh Government to improve NHS waiting times. Our approach is grounded in the belief that public services, such as healthcare, should not just be fit for purpose today, but be robust and resilient for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Treating cancer early is absolutely critical for survival rates. In England, the target is to have 85% of patients treated within 62 days. Now, in Wales, that target is more generous. It's just 75%, and yet it has never been achieved. The current rate is an appalling 56.7%, much worse than the equivalent figure in England. So why is it that Welsh Labour is underperforming England, and is it really still the blueprint for government?
Secretary of State.
More people in Wales have been told that they don't have cancer than ever before, and that's good news. Performance increased against the 62-day target for treatment in June compared to the previous month, and over the last 2 years, the number of patients waiting longer than 2 years has reduced. Average waits for treatment remain steady.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Torsten Bell.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This weekend we remembered the late Queen.
and her enduring legacy of service and devotion to our country. And I was proud to announce a new national monument located at St James's Park to honour her memory. And I know the whole House will join me in sending our best wishes to the Princess of Wales as she completes her treatment. Mr Speaker, this afternoon we'll introduce the Renters' Rights Bill. After years of inaction, this government will oversee the biggest levelling up of renters' rights in a generation, and I urge the whole House to get behind it. And later this week I'll visit Washington to meet President Biden for a strategic discussion on foreign policy. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in the House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Torsten Bell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Back in the 1990s, the Conservatives claimed that the minimum wage would cost 1 million jobs. Instead, low earners have seen the fastest pay rises year after year, with no effect on employment. Year after year, which they oppose. Today, and under their watch, 1 million workers are on 0 hours contracts, and over a million people have no sick pay whatsoever, facing risks that nobody in this House would bear. The details matter, but it is outdated nonsense.
Order. Please sit. One, it's easier if you face me, I can hear it better. But the second part is it's meant to be a question, not a statement. No, I decide. Prime Minister. Don't I?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Economic growth is our #1 mission, and that's why we forged a new positive relationship with business. But too many people are insecure at work, and that holds them back and holds our economy back. This government was elected to deliver for working people, and that is exactly what we will do.
We come to the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join with the Prime Minister in his words about Her late Majesty the Queen, but also in his words about the Princess of Wales? She's been in the thoughts of everyone across the country, and I know everyone in the House will be delighted and relieved at the progress that she has made. May I also, Mr Speaker, take this opportunity to pay tribute to Nicholas Howard. This is his last Prime Minister's questions after supporting 8 consecutive Prime Ministers through these sessions. Never my favourite part of the week, but his commendable service made it far more manageable. Mr Speaker, yesterday Labour MPs voted to remove the winter fuel payment from over 10 million British pensioners, including those with just £13,000 of income. With that decision debated and made, it is now important that the House understands the full consequences of the government's choice. So can I very specifically ask the Prime Minister, will he now publish the impact assessment before the House rises?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is this. They left a £22 billion black hole. Hid it from the OBR. Richard Hughes is absolutely clear. It's the largest year-ahead overspend outside of the pandemic. Now, of course, when it comes to mitigations and impacts, we've put those in place. Ramping up pension credit, dealing with housing benefit and linking it, something the party opposite didn't do for years. And because of the tough decisions that we're making to stabilise the economy, we can make sure that the triple lock shows that increases in pensions will outstrip any loss of payments. But before he complains about us clearing up his mess, perhaps he'd like to apologise for the £22 billion black hole.
Mr Speaker, this has got... Mr Speaker.
I want to hear the question.
Mr Speaker, when I was in government, I delivered record increases in the state pension. We protected the winter fuel payment and we gave pensioners cost of living benefits. He's the one that's taking money away from pensioners on £13,000, Mr Speaker. But this has got nothing to do with the public finances. His own Chancellor just this morning, his MPs may not have been listening to her, his own Chancellor this morning admitted that she would prefer it if this policy didn't even raise any money, Mr Speaker. Obviously, the government would not have made this decision without an impact analysis. And yesterday, the Energy Minister confirmed that. So I ask, very simply again, why won't he publish the assessment now?
Mr. Speaker, I remember the days when the Conservative Party was to be concerned about balancing the books. They've left a £22 billion black hole. Responsibility for this decision lies there. The only way to rebuild our country and invest in our public services and make sure everyone is better off is if we clear up their mess and deal with the £22 billion black hole. But, Mr. Speaker, last week we learned that the Shadow Housing Secretary was calling for means testing of winter fuel payments. Now it turns out that the Shadow Paymaster General agrees with her and even boasted about texting his own mother saying she didn't need the payment. Until he apologises for the mess they've created, he's no position to criticise the action that we're taking.
Mr. Speaker, they're shouting now, but those arguments didn't even convince 50 of his own MPs, who suddenly found that they had urgent business elsewhere yesterday, Mr. Speaker. But we know why he's hiding the impact assessment. The Labour Party's own previous analysis claimed that this policy could cause 3,850 deaths. So are the numbers in his impact assessment higher or lower than that?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're taking this decision to stabilise the economy. That means we can commit to the triple lock. By committing to the triple lock, we can make sure that payments of state pension are higher, and therefore there's more money in the pocket of pensioners, notwithstanding the tough action that we need to take. But he goes around pretending that everything's fine. That's the argument he tried in the election. And that's why he's sitting there and we are sitting here.
Mr. Speaker, today pensioners watching will have seen that the Prime Minister has repeatedly refused to admit or to publish the consequences of his decision, and we will continue holding him account for that. But changing topics, Mr. Speaker, today is Back British Farming Day, where we recognise that British farmers produce food that is higher quality, has higher welfare standards and higher environmental standards than imported food. And at a time of increasing global volatility, they are also crucial for our food security and national security. Can he therefore confirm, whether he will be adopting the NFU's recent proposal to enshrine a national food security target in law?
Prime Minister.
Well, food security is really important. I'm glad he's raised that. We have talked to the NFU about this, and rural issues are really important, and that's what we fought the election on, why we've got a lot of rural constituencies sitting behind me now. We'll continue to talk to the NFU. We do take food security very, very seriously.
I'm not sure I did hear a specific answer, Mr. Speaker, but farmers also do great work to preserve the beauty of the British countryside, and something I'm sure that the Prime Minister will appreciate, given his newfound preference for landscapes over political portraiture. But when it comes to land use, there are currently protections in place to ensure that the most productive farmland is used for food production rather than alternatives like solar. So does he agree that it is not appropriate or right that developers with a vested interest grade the quality of that farmland themselves? And will he look at making that process independent?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, rural communities were neglected under the last government. Confidence was at an all-time low. And thousands of food and farming businesses have been forced out of business. Now, of course, we will work with them. Of course, we'll get the balance right. But we're again picking up, clearing up the mess and rebuilding our country.
Mr. Speaker, as a glimpse, in Wales, the Labour government hammered farmers, hitting them with top-down eco-targets. And Labour's own assessment of those plans said that it would lead to thousands of job losses, less food security, and destroy rural incomes, while farmers described it as bleak and damaging. So can he reassure English farmers that he won't threaten their livelihoods, and can he rule out imposing those same top-down targets here?
Prime Minister.
We will work with farmers across the whole of the United Kingdom, as we've made clear, to support them. But here we are. Absolutely clear. No contrition, no responsibility for the economic black hole, the broken NHS, the prison crisis. the ruinous legacy of 14 years of failure. We've started rebuilding the country, renters reform, house building, GB Energy, National Wealth Fund, Border Security Command, I could go on. Whilst they try to rewrite history, we're getting on with building a better country for the future.
Madam Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will firstly join me in paying our respects to Lieutenant Rodri Lyshan, who tragically passed away last week. My thoughts are with the family, loved ones, HMS Queen Elizabeth crew during this very difficult time. Mr. Speaker, housing in Portsmouth is in dire straits, but local residents in Portsmouth North have valid concerns around population density, infrastructure and the environment. So I'm glad this government is working on delivering affordable housing in the city. Can the Prime Minister ensure that the infrastructure is properly considered and that communities are involved in the planning process for any new developments?
Can I start by saying I'm sure the whole House will want to join me in sending condolences to the family of Lieutenant Lyshan. I agree with her on the desperate need for affordable housing, and that's why we're going to deliver the biggest social affording housing uplift in a generation. We will get Britain building again 1.5 million houses because the dream of home ownership was snuffed out under the last government.
We now come to the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself and my party with the comments made earlier by the Prime Minister about our amazing late Queen, and also join him in sending our best wishes to Her Royal Highness, Princess of Wales. I don't think anyone could have not been moved by her powerful video, and we hope that she'll make a full and speedy recovery. When it comes to fighting cancer, we know all too well that every day counts. But in the last year of the last government, there were over 100,000 patients waiting more than 2 months just to start their urgent cancer treatment, the worst on record. So will the Prime Minister help boost cancer survival rates by guaranteeing that every patient can start their cancer treatment within 62 days?
Well, I thank him for that question on a really important issue, and there's a report out by Lord Darcy tomorrow which will set out in stark terms the failure in terms of cancer treatment under the last government, which is a really serious issue. This timeline matters, which is why we're taking steps straight away to make sure that we can comply with that timeline, because lives depend on it. And that's why we've already taken a decision to put more scanners in to catch this early and use technology. It's a very serious issue, very serious failure by the last government.
Sir Ed Davey.
Prime Minister, for that answer, and also look at the plans that the government is putting forward. Last night, Liberal Democrats voted against the withdrawing of winter fuel payments. We believe it's just wrong to balance the books by removing the support from pensioners. But we do understand that there are some difficult choices to be made to clear up the appalling financial mess left by the last Conservative government. One of the many reasons for that mess was the Conservatives prioritising tax cuts for the big banks, costing £4 billion a year.
They pay more tax.
So will the Prime Minister instead reverse those cuts so that we can afford to support millions of struggling pensioners through this very hard winter?
Well, I'll resist the temptation to get ahead of the budget. But look, what is important is that we recognise that there is this £22 billion black hole that's been left by the previous government. Now, I know that their practice was ignore it, to kick it into long grass. We're taking the tough decisions because I'm absolutely convinced that's the only way we can start rebuilding our country, investing in our public services and making sure that everybody is better off.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Southport constituency has experienced a difficult summer. Firstly, I want to reiterate that our thoughts are with the families of Alice, Bibi and Elsie, who tragically lost their lives in the attack in July. I welcomed the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary to our town in the weeks that followed, and we work together to find further ways to bring our community together. Can I therefore ask the Prime Minister to take this opportunity to recommit the government's support for our town for those grieving and affected by the tragic attack?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for that question, and we stand with those who tragically lost their loved ones in this heinous attack. I did go up to Southport the day after and went back actually 3 days after that on a private visit to meet some of the first responders who had been at the scene and simply to say thank you to them. I can't tell the House how angry I was when I got back to London and saw that those same officers who had responded were having things thrown at them by far-right thugs. Mr. Speaker, we will work tirelessly to support his constituents, and I thank him as well for his hard work in this difficult time, working with Sefton Borough Council and Liverpool City Region Combined Authority to deliver a support package. The communities endured this horrendous event should be supported, and I know will be, across the whole House.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday we witnessed some extraordinary celebratory scenes outside Britain's prisons where in some cases serious career criminals were released. And this to make way for, yes, rioters, but equally those who've said unpleasant things on Facebook and elsewhere on social media. Does the Prime Minister understand there is a growing feeling of anger in this country that we are living through two-tier policing and a two-tier justice system?
I'm angry to be put in a position of having to release people who should be in prison because the last government broke the prison system. And the Prime Minister was repeatedly warned. He had his own release scheme. He was repeatedly warned that he had to adopt the scheme that we put in place. The former Justice Minister said if we don't do it, we'll have to get down on our knees and pray. The police chiefs made it absolutely clear in a letter to him before the election that he needed to take action, saying that they wouldn't be able to discharge their duties and saying the risk was loss of an ability to detain suspects. That means, Mr. Speaker, an inability to arrest people committing offences. That's how bad it was, and they warned the Leader of the Opposition that further delays until after the general election will increase the risk significantly. What did he do? He delayed and increased the risks.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's swift action to bring railways back into public ownership. Great British Railways will deliver much-needed reform, ensuring the network serves both passengers and rail freight effectively. So can the Prime Minister explain how Labour's ambitious railway plan will also deliver improvements to rail infrastructure to ensure my constituents get the service they deserve at Luton Station?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising that important matter. One of the first bills that we introduced was to reform our railways after 14 years of chaos. Great British Railways will unite track and train under a single leadership, and that means closer collaboration across the industry and faster, more effective decisions on critical infrastructure. And I know how vital that will be in relation to both Luton and Leagrave stations in her constituency. We're carefully considering the best approach, but I can assure her we're committed to ensuring our railways will be open to everyone.
Tessa Mount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is Back British Farming Day. The previous government let our farmers down and in their incompetence underspent the farming budget by £100 million. Will the Prime Minister deny rumours that his government plans to take advantage of the Conservatives' failure by removing that £100 million permanently? Farmers across the country want to know that the Prime Minister will increase the agriculture budget, as the Lib Dem manifesto proposed, to speed up the rollout of the new environmental land management schemes to support profitable, sustainable and nature-friendly farming.
Well, I thank you for that question. It is a really important issue, and our rural communities were neglected by the previous government, and that's why confidence is at an all-time low. And what we will do is to protect farmers from being undercut in trade deals, make the supply chain work more fairly, and prevent shock rises in bills by switching to GB energy. We won't preempt the budget in relation to this, but we will put the support in place. Thank you.
Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents, including those at Chapel Gate, have told me about the so-called management agents who charge them rip-off service fees and then fail to provide even the most basic of maintenance. Many of them spend hours each week battling with these agents just to ensure that they and their neighbours are not fleeced in their own homes. Will the Prime Minister recommit this government to act where the previous government failed, to reform the leasehold system, which is archaic, outdated and feudal?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I first welcome the first ever Labour MP for Basingstoke? And yes, we will reiterate our commitment to act to bring the feudal leasehold system to an end and ensure leaseholders can benefit from more rights, power and protections over their homes.
Brendan O'Hara.
Mr Speaker, international law is clear. Dropping £2,000 bombs on densely populated civilian areas is a crime. And it's beyond dispute that Israel has used F-35s to do exactly that. Yet the government has chosen to exempt F-35 components from the arms licence suspension, when all it had to do was say that Israel could not be the end user if UK manufactured parts were included. Last week, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister stood at that dispatch box and he said, we either comply with international law or we do not.
That's right.
Why has he chosen not to?
Prime Minister.
We are complying with international law. We've set out our reasoning, and I think all fair-minded members of the House would support the decision that we've taken. The most important thing now is that we get a ceasefire in place. That is one of the topics that I'll be discussing on Friday, to ensure that the remaining hostages can come out, that aid that's desperately needed can go in, and we can start the process to a two-state solution, which is the only way to lasting peace.
Graham Downey.
Fife has a proud defence heritage, and in my constituency of Dunfermline and Dollar, that continues with the dockyard at Rosyth constructing Type 31 frigates for the Royal Navy, along with a local supply chain of local SMEs. So will the Prime Minister ensure the Strategic Defence Review team visits areas of strategic importance such as Fife, so they can engage fully with the local supply chain and ensure the SDSR supports Britain's security as well as local economies?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for that question and for championing his constituency, including the work at Rosyth Dockyard. The Strategic Defence Review will ensure that defence is central both to security and to economic growth and prosperity. The review will consult widely, including across the devolved nations, and I know the reviewers recognise the strategic importance of constituencies like his, and I will ensure that he gets the chance to meet the relevant minister to discuss the particular issues in his constituency.
Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The previous Conservative government committed to a rebuild of Whipps Cross Hospital, the Princess Alexandra Hospital in Harlow, and the establishment of a new community.
You have to sit down a minute. Look, I'm determined to hear this question. I don't expect the front bench to be shouting me down, and it won't happen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The previous Conservative government...
Trying to join in again?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The previous Conservative government committed to a rebuild of Whipps Cross Hospital, the Princess Alexandra Hospital in Harlow, and the establishment of a new community diagnostic centre at St Margaret's Hospital in Epping. Will the new Labour government honour these commitments and progress these projects in full, which are so vital to improving the health services needed by my constituents of Epping Forest? And if it helps the Prime Minister at all with his answer, these services will also help some of the constituents of his Health Secretary just next door in Ilford North.
Prime Minister.
Well, look, he's right to champion the hospitals in his constituency, quite right to do so. The problem with what the last government promised was this. They promised 40 new hospitals. The problem was there weren't 40, they weren't new, and many of them weren't hospitals. So we need to review what we can do and put it on a sustainable, deliverable basis. But we will, and he's right to champion those in his constituency.
Or are being built.
Annalise Bidgley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last week, I met my constituent, Cheryl Corbell, mother of Olivia Pratt Corbell, the 9-year-old tragically murdered in 2022. Cheryl is campaigning for Olivia's Law, which would compel convicted criminals to attend court and face the judge and receive their sentence. Will my right honourable friend commit to supporting Olivia's Law and meet Cheryl to discuss how we can move this forward without delay?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the King's Speech, we confirmed that we intend to introduce legislation this session so courts have the power to order the most serious offenders to attend their sentencing hearings. This is really important, and I know it's felt across the House, because to deprive victims and their families of seeing the sentencing exercise is to deprive them of justice. I will meet Cheryl. I have already met Cheryl and gave her the commitment last August that we would do this, and I repeat it again today, and I would just pay tribute to the campaign that she has led.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the Prime Minister was a pensioner earning $11,350 this year and receiving no winter fuel payment, what would he prioritise this Christmas? Heating or eating?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have to be clear why this decision is being made. A £22 billion black hole. And the previous government would walk past these tough decisions, pretend it wasn't there, put it in the long grass. We're not prepared to do that. Because we're taking tough decisions, we can commit to the triple lock, and that means that the state pension will increase by more than any loss of the winter payment allowance. But I would just say this, the biggest impact on pensioners in recent years was when they lost control of inflation, when they allowed energy prices to go through the roof, and we went through a cost of living crisis. We're stabilising the economy to make sure pensioners never, ever have to live through that again.
Mark Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Annabelle is 5 years old and lives in my constituency. She has high-risk neuroblastoma. Annabelle has endured 15 months of chemotherapy, high-dose chemotherapy, stem cell harvest, proton therapy, immunotherapy, hair loss, nasal feeding. Now she urgently needs the drug DFMO, not yet available in the UK. It must be administered within 90 days of the end of immunotherapy. 91 days is too late. Will the Prime Minister please meet with Annabelle's parents to discuss the life-saving care that she needs?
Prime Minister.
Can I pay tribute to Annabelle for her incredible bravery and understand how important it is that cancer patients are able to benefit from rapid access to effective new treatments. The manufacturers of this drug have applied for a UK licence through Project Orbis, which allows the rapid review and approval of new cancer treatments. And we'll ensure that process is completed as quickly as possible. And I will also ensure that the Health Minister does set up the meeting that he's asked for.
Dame Harriet Ball.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thought that socialism was about taxing those with the broadest shoulders in order to help the most vulnerable. But it appears that Starmer socialism involves scaring those with the broadest shoulders out of the country while taking away the winter fuel allowance of frail 90-year-olds living in drafty homes. Will the Prime Minister apologise to my shivering constituents for his personal choice? And will he reverse this chilling decision?
My choice is to stabilise the economy after 14 years of failure. And I'll tell you for why. Because when a government loses control of the economy, it's working people who pay the price, and I will not let that happen under a Labour government.
Paulette Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than half of people with pancreatic cancer die within 3 months of diagnosis, and 7 in 10 people never even receive treatment. Every 2 minutes in the UK, someone is diagnosed with cancer. But for those diagnosed with the least survivable cancer, time has too often already run out. I'm really proud of the Labour government's commitment to our NHS, but will the Prime Minister now commit to reviewing a long-term cancer strategy so we can improve diagnosis and treatment rates in this country?
Prime Minister.
I thank her for raising this important issue, and it's obviously the second time it's been raised in this session. I'll have a lot more to say tomorrow when I deal with Lord Darcy's report. I pay tribute to her tireless campaigning, particularly in relation to pancreatic cancer. Cancer patients have been failed by the last government, waiting far too long for diagnosis and treatment. We'll get the NHS catching cancer on time, diagnosing it earlier and treating it faster, so more patients survive this horrible set of diseases.
Louis French.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Following Labour's disgraceful political decision to scrap winter fuel payments with little notice to millions of pensioners, will the Prime Minister today rule out scrapping concessionary travel fares and council tax discounts, which also help millions of pensioners across the UK? Yes or no?
Prime Minister.
Well, as he knows very well, I'm not going to preempt the budget. It will all be set out in due course.
Speaker, can I pass on the heartfelt thanks on behalf of the Bolton Council of Mosques, who greatly appreciated the dedication and leadership that the Prime Minister showed during the recent riots over the summer. Does my right honourable friend agree with me on the importance of supporting interfaith and community groups who play a vital role in bringing people together?
Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising that. And we owe an incredible debt of gratitude to our police for their courage in dealing with the recent disorders. And we took action to ensure they had the resources and powers they needed to tackle violence and restore order to our streets. We also, Mr. Speaker, provided additional security for mosques, ensuring freedom of worship and protection from racist threats. And in the aftermath, we saw communities who really represent Britain coming forward, led by faith groups and community organisations. They showed that unity and demonstrated our values of tolerance and of respect.
Anne Davies.
Diolch Llefarydd. Denmark has been undergrounding its electricity cables since 2008, building infrastructure and maintaining responsible stewardship of the countryside. The Welsh Labour government's policy is for all new power lines to be placed underground where possible. The UK Labour government favours overhead pylons. Why is his government opposing Welsh colleagues in Wales?
We are absolutely committed to the transition to renewable energy. The reason for that is because it gives us energy independence, it lowers the bills, and of course the next generation of jobs are tied up with it. We have to do it in a cost-effective way, and we'll make those decisions in the cost-effective way.
Jessica Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK steel industry needs a serious government which works in partnership with both businesses and trade unions to secure a transition that's both right for the workforce and delivers economic growth in Wales. We know that deindustrialisation can be devastating to communities, so can the Prime Minister tell me how the government's safeguarding jobs and securing the future of steelmaking communities like ours for generations to come?
Prime Minister.
We're taking every step we can in relation to the steel industry because it's vital that we give it the support that it needs. We need steel in this country. We need steel made in this country. And our plans and our missions mean we're going to need more steel, not less. And it's the duty of the government to ensure jobs and communities and people aren't ignored in the transition and that jobs are protected. And Mr. Speaker, I can say the Business Secretary will provide an update to the House this afternoon.
Ollie Glover.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oxfordshire has seen a huge amount of population growth in recent years without the infrastructure to match.
Why is that?
A new railway station on the Great Western Main Line between Didcot and Swindon, Grove and Wantage, would help to reduce traffic and improve access to both Oxford and London. Does the Prime Minister support investment in our railway, and would he meet with me to hear the case for a new railway station at Grove and Wantage?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for raising this important issue, obviously very important for his constituents. And we are committed to putting passengers at the heart of our railways. Great British Railways will work closely with regional government, mayors, operators and passenger groups to ensure rail investment meets the needs of communities. And I will ensure that he gets the meeting that he wants with the relevant minister to discuss the issues in his constituency.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. I'll let the front benches clear. No problems, take. Right, we now come to the statements. Secretary of State for Business, Jonathan Reynolds.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the improved deal this Labour government has secured for the workers of Tata Steel, specifically as it relates to their plant in Port Talbot. But as well as setting out the details of this improved deal, I am also announcing today our ambition for a new UK-wide steel strategy, one which equips our steelmaking industry with the right support, not just to adapt, but to thrive in the new green economy. But before I do so, I want to address the situation we have inherited. Since becoming the Secretary of State 2 months ago, I've had to respond to a series of challenges, not just with the steel industry, but also in shipping, such as Harland and Wolff, and in other areas where the previous government had simply ceased to make decisions and decided to leave them for us to deal with. This was a dereliction of duty, and it has left the steel industry in particular in an extremely perilous position. The last government had been promising a plan for the steel industry for years. With what I'm able to announce today, with the signing of a legally binding deal that enables Tata to order their electric arc furnace as part of a significantly improved package, this government has made more progress in 2 months than they made over the last Parliament. But even if we had started these negotiations a year ago, never mind many years ago, as they had the opportunity to do, I have no doubt we would have secured an even better deal for the community. So I would like to start with an apology to the people of Port Talbot, because they were let down by the previous government. And whilst this deal is much improved, I acknowledge very much it falls short of what would be my ideal. However, I have been to Port Talbot several times. I've met the workforce there, the reps, the generations of families who have literally forged Port Talbot as we know it. And that's why, when Tata first announced they would be closing the blast furnaces with some 2,800 job losses with them, I knew the workforce deserved so much better. I warned my predecessor not to proceed with what they had negotiated. Why? Because I was confident the government could secure a better deal for Tata's workers and a better deal for the people of Port Talbot. And Mr. Speaker, I'm able to announce today that this government has secured that better deal. But I reiterate, had we had the opportunity that the previous government had over so many years, we could have done more. The key features are as follows. I can announce today that we've agreed a process with Tata to assess investment opportunities for new, additional capabilities that will deliver more secure, long-term jobs than the deal that we inherited. This is on top of the plans for the instalment of the electric arc furnace. We have agreed a process with Tata to take this forward, and I'll be able to report back to the House on this progress. But for me, this is the most important element. And I should therefore explain, Mr. Speaker, that the reason I'm announcing this deal now, rather than after this process is complete, is because in order for Tata to secure the build slot for the electric arc furnace, that element needs to be sorted now. Further delays would put the whole project at risk and could lead to a much, much worse outcome. Secondly, in every conversation I've had with Tata's directors, I've stressed the need to avoid compulsory redundancies wherever possible. I've asked them to channel their efforts instead into job matching and retraining so that the steelworkers of Port Talbot, who've dedicated so much to the industry in the past, can now help shape its future as they'll be able to transition and move within the business. But as well as that, Tata are agreeing to offer a comprehensive training programme for any employee as an alternative to those at risk of compulsory redundancy. This would be on full pay for 1 month and then £27,000 a year per employee for 11 months. And Tata will fund all of these costs. Employees will be able to choose from recognised qualifications to develop sought-after skills which will be in high demand in the local economy now and long into the future. We know too that Tata expects that during the construction of the electric arc furnace, at least 500 new jobs could be created, which will tap into the local labour market wherever possible. Thirdly, where we cannot secure new jobs or training, working closely with the unions, I can tell the House that we've helped to secure improved terms on redundancies. Tata's employees are now able to express an interest in the most generous voluntary redundancy package the company has ever offered for a restructuring of this size. Employees will now be paid 2.8 weeks of earnings for each year of service, up to a maximum of 25 years. At the same time, we're ensuring there's a minimum redundancy payment, £15,000 pro rata, and a retention payment of £5,000 for employees leaving the business because of these closures. And over 2,000 members of staff have expressed an interest in voluntary redundancy who will be eligible for these terms. Fourthly, as part of the deal, the company will also be releasing 385 acres of their site for sale or transfer. This is valuable real estate which will help bring in more companies and more employers, not just from the steel sector, but from a whole host of other industries too, helping to diversify the workforce at Port Talbot. While those on the opposition benches told us there was no alternative to what was originally proposed, we knew that there was, and we've bargained hard for it. And we're putting in watertight conditions within our grant funding agreement for job guarantees to claw back investment if these jobs do not materialise. For example, there is now an improved grant repayment of £40,000 for every job that is not retained post-transformation. This money will be repaid directly to the government and is a powerful incentive for Tata to deliver and meet the 5,000 UK jobs target. But, Mr. Speaker, our ambition for steel is so much bigger and broader than one single company. It is about the whole sector. The UK has always been a proud steelmaking nation with a rich heritage stretching back to the Industrial Revolution, from cars to cranes to ships and scaffolding. British steel has been and is still used the world over, embodying our industrial might and innovation. And yet for years, steel has been a neglected industry in this country. Crude steel production has declined by more than 50% in the last 10 years. Indeed, some proclaimed the industry's decline would be inevitable in the 21st century, that it was somehow a sunset industry. But, Mr. Speaker, those people are wrong. On this side of the House, we have never believed that decline is inevitable. And while the industry faces challenges today, we want to do everything we can to ensure that it can adapt and grow tomorrow. And that's why I'm pleased to announce that we will introduce our new steel strategy. As honourable members know, our manifesto included plans to make available £2.5 billion for steel, on top of the £500 million transformation of Port Talbot. And our intention is to increase our UK capabilities, something the previous government never attempted, so that we can create a more vibrant, competitive steel sector in the UK. As part of our steel strategy, this government will look seriously at options to improve steel capabilities across the supply chain, including in primary steelmaking. And we are also clear that we won't be able to prioritise short-term subsidies over long-term jobs. But that is why, with the help of independent experts, we will also be reviewing the viability of technologies for the production of primary steel, including possibly direct reduced iron. Steel is essential to delivering on our net zero goals and building the next generation of green infrastructure, which is something I know members of this government are passionate about. And that is why, as part of our steel strategy, we intend to use the new Procurement Act to drive economic growth and account for social value in the things the government buys and the projects we commission. This work is already underway to increase the role of steel as we build our manufacturing base. We also recognise that for far too long, British energy-intensive industries, including the steel sector, have been held back by high electricity costs. More often than not, this has made the UK less attractive to international investors, but we are going to take action. Our clean energy mission will ensure we are no longer exposed to the kind of gas price shocks we've seen in recent years, helping British businesses to compete and win in the global market. To support that ambition, we're also working with other like-minded nations to tackle global trade distortions, including through our chairing of the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity this year. Our steel strategy will be developed and delivered in partnership with the steel sector and the trade unions, and it will work in lockstep with the government's industrial strategy. Our ambition to ramp up investment, strengthen our supply chains, and create more well-paid jobs in the places where they're needed the most. To drive our partnership on the steel strategy forward, I will shortly meet with industry experts and interested parties to discuss the future of the industry, and we intend to publish the steel strategy in spring of next year. But, Mr. Speaker, this is a government that cares about steel and cares about the communities it supports and recognises its fundamental importance to the economy. And supporting steel in this country is involved in being involved in the detail, shepherding individual plants into the future while protecting the people within them. But it's also about providing a direction of travel, an inspiration for investment and a cause for confidence so that the sector can play its part in the next 10 years and beyond. We're not naive, Mr. Speaker, about the scale of the challenge before us. But while this is still challenging, I believe that this is both a better deal than that was on the table for Port Talbot and the maximum improvement that we could make in 2 months. It represents both a better destination and a better transition to the bright future that steel will have under this government. And I commend this statement to the House.
Prime Minister Gregson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement? I wish I could say I was surprised by any of the contents, but it has, of course, been relentlessly briefed to the media and press over the last couple of days. It's also no surprise that once again Labour are presiding over the demise of our steel sector. Under the last Labour government, output fell 47%, 56% of jobs were lost, and today's deal now means 100% of output gone at Port Talbot, with an electric arc furnace taking, at best, Mr. Speaker, 5 years to get up and running, with some suggesting 8 to 9 years before a single new job is created, if we see any new jobs at all. This is, as the statement says, a transition, but it is a heartbreaking transition for thousands of people, a transition from people in work to people out of work. Why didn't, Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State take steps in his discussions with Tata to ensure that the blast furnace was not closed before the new arc furnace can open? Is this really the new Labour playbook? Scrap jobs, scrap production, and become reliant on higher polluting countries for imports. That, Mr. Speaker, is not what I call decarbonisation. I must say, I do feel a little sorry for the Secretary of State, who has been dispatched here today to announce these spending decisions just a day after Labour's day of shame on winter fuel cuts for pensioners. In government, Conservatives provided a grant of £500 million towards the £1.25 billion invested by Tata Steel. At the time, this was one of the largest support packages in government history. At the time of the last government's announcement, this support was expected to save at least 5,000 jobs in the company. We worked with the Welsh Government and Tata Steel to establish a dedicated transition board to support affected employees and the local economy, backed by £100 million in total. So can the Secretary of State update on any of those job projections when he returns to the dispatch box? But further, Mr. Speaker, today's announcement is notable by the absence of any reassurance or plans for the thousands of steelworkers in Scunthorpe who may not have jobs by Christmas. Equally as notable in today's announcement is once again a failure from the government to commit any detail on the domestic production of virgin steel. He says we'll have a steel strategy in the spring when thousands of jobs and production capacity has been scrapped today. It was no surprise that last week, during the urgent question on steel, the Industry Minister failed to commit 4 times to safeguarding the future of virgin steel production in this country. I'm sure the Secretary of State doesn't need reminding that if he allows Scunthorpe to close too, we'll be the only G7 country without the ability to produce virgin steel, leaving us open and vulnerable to cheap foreign imports, particularly from China. To his credit, he has always argued against offshoring our steel industry. He conceded once that this would be a fundamental political mistake. So can I ask him what conversations he has had with the Secretaries of State for Transport and for Defence about the impact of this government's new steel policy on our national security and ability to deliver infrastructure? Can he assure the House that he's doing everything in his power to make sure we do not lose virgin steel manufacturing here in the United Kingdom? For the benefit of new colleagues, the government Then, when in opposition, we're committed to a £28 billion a year of borrowing to fund their decarbonisation plans. A price tag which has magically disappeared, but a target which has not. Of this, the Secretary of State made promises to the steel industry. Where are they now? Where is that money? Is he still battling the Chancellor? We know Labour's unions are quite successful in squeezing money from the Treasury, so maybe he can send them to stand up for the Chancellor if he's having problems. But, Mr. Speaker, this government has our support to ensure the future of steelmaking in this country is sustainable. That speaks beyond Tata and beyond South Wales. Only in Labour's world can the word improved mean fewer jobs and higher polluting imports. Absolutely. So I hope the Secretary of State can return to the dispatch box and do better for UK steelmaking.
Secretary of State.
Well now, Mr. Speaker, I've been a Member of Parliament for 14 years, and I think I've seen some interesting political events in those 14 years. I don't think I've ever heard such a brass neck on a contribution from the Conservative Party, and there's quite a menu to choose from. Let me just explain what I was doing on polling week leading up to the 4th of July. At this point, I was sat over there, still if Parliament had been sitting. I was the Shadow Secretary of State. And I was going from key seat to key seat, as you would expect us to do. And I was negotiating with unions and with Tata and with every relevant body, my colleagues in the Welsh Government, to prevent action that would have resulted in the closure entirely of Port Talbot on polling day. It was like the government had already gone. They were not on the pitch. So the first thing I had to do before I even became the Secretary of State was make sure there was something there to save, because it would have gone had it been the party opposite. Let me also just... you really need to listen to this, because part of those contributions were factually inaccurate, and I will help you by telling you what the situation actually is. This will save more jobs. That's the point of the new investment. And for those people who are unable to get those new jobs, there will be better terms for them. There will be a better cushioning of their retraining into the rest of the economy. I've explained why it is a better deal. And I hope the Honourable Member has seen this. He did mention some of the media. I'd just like to say that hasn't come from my department, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate there are lots of interested parties in this. But the unions have recognised it as a better deal. Our Welsh Labour government has recognised it as a better deal. And I hope, taking a step back from that statement, the Conservative Party recognises why this will make such a difference. Now, when I talked about my frustration, Mr. Speaker, because the Honourable Member mentioned virgin steelmaking, he will understand that the two blast furnace sites, Scunthorpe and Port Talbot, lose a great deal of money every day. And they're so fed up with the lack of action under the last government that they have put timescales on the closure of that. So the simple truth is that I do not have the time frame that was available to the Conservative Party. And even more when it comes to somewhere like Scunthorpe, I do not have in place things like the carbon capture infrastructure yet that would be necessary for the kind of solution I would ideally want. The kind of hybrid the Honourable Member is putting forward, keeping the blast furnaces open whilst you bring online the electric arc furnaces. I would love to be in a position to look at that, but all the time that we could have done and could have worked on that was under the Conservative government, and you didn't do it. And therefore the options available to us are far less, and the situation is far more challenging. Now, specifically in relation to Scunthorpe, yes, I've had many meetings since I became the Secretary of State with the UK management, but also with Mr. Lee, the principal shareholder. I've had 3, I believe, as Secretary of State, and I met him as the Shadow Secretary of State. We have been clear that we want there to be a transition in Scunthorpe, that we want to put up government money alongside what that company may do, but it's got to be a transition. It's got to be a transition to the future, and the workforce and the route that is offered to them has to be part of that. But my frustration is that the options available to me, even if successful, Mr. Speaker, in doing that, are still very, very difficult for that area. The kind of solution I would ideally want to deliver, that could have been delivered by the party opposite in those long 14 years, is not available. And I think, leaving this chamber today, I hope the Conservative Party can reflect both on the mistakes they have made, their lack of action, the legacy that they bequeathed us, but fundamentally the improvements we've been able to make in such a short period of time.
Chair of the Select Committee, Liam Byrne.
Speaker, not yet Chair of a Select Committee, but fingers crossed. I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement today, and I hope the whole House will recognise that what has brought us today is not a set of sound bites, but a strategy that would actually benefit from a stronger cross-party consensus for the long term. And so I do hope that this could be the subject of a future Select Committee inquiry. But the Secretary of State rightly puts his finger on the key issue, which is that to safeguard the future of the steel industry, we need to de-risk the demand for steel in this country. So what reassurances can he give the House today about how we will use procurement and, crucially, the creation of a bigger offshore wind industry in this country to drive that demand that will keep the furnaces going at Port Talbot and elsewhere? This was the country that pioneered steel making. We need to reinvent now its future.
Can I just say to members, especially senior members, when you look that way, I can't hear what you say. Please, go through the chair. That's where we keep the neutrality working as well. Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for that. He is absolutely right. What we are seeking to do here is not just deliver new, improved transition deals for the key sites, but improve the overall business and investor environment for steel in the UK. I do believe that can be done. When it comes to the kind of future investments that we are thinking about, I do believe there are core capacities that could be very successful in the United Kingdom. Obviously, in 2 months, that is not sufficient for the due diligence that is required around some of the elaborate and quite considered business cases that are necessary to do that. But the process going forward is about delivering that, and I think we can turn this into an extremely positive story for UK steel.
We now come to the Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Steelmaking is of vital strategic importance to the UK. We need it to build the crucial infrastructure needed to generate sustainable growth and to safeguard our national security. And the neglect of the steel industry in recent years is just another part of the previous government's disastrous legacy. Today's announcement is a welcome sign of change. The steps the government have outlined to help protect jobs and, crucially, to develop a steel strategy are long overdue. We need to finally move on from a patchwork of last-minute rescues to a long-term plan that will set the industry on a sustainable footing. And this is as true of the steel industry as it is across our economy. We desperately need a real industrial strategy to work in tandem with this plan for steel. So will the Secretary of State assure us that his steel strategy will be fully aligned with a wider industrial strategy and will take a view of steel's importance to our economy and society as a whole? And will it aim to balance the need for infrastructure, national security and net zero commitments? And will he assure us that he will bring the strategy to this House by spring next year for scrutiny and debate so that the industry can finally move on with certainty?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the honourable members' words and the recognition of the improvement that we've made with this deal, but fundamentally about the need for that better business environment and moving away from relatively short-term responses to that much better, more secure, long-term framework around that. She will understand the significant increase in investment this new government is willing to make can make a substantial difference. However, the emphasis on that has got to be on long-term investments for the future, for long-term secure jobs. There's several different ways we can do that. I absolutely agree it should be aligned with the industrial strategy. We'll be able to make some announcements on that in the near future, leading up to the launch of the steel strategy next year.
The other potential chair of the Select Committee, Matt Weston.
Mr. Speaker, that's incredibly gracious of you. I hope those words were heard across the chamber. Can I welcome the Secretary of State to his place, but also really underline the importance of his commitment and the strength of his negotiation. I really welcome that. As has been heard, the point about public procurement, I think, is really important. So I would add my voice to that. But can I also just draw his attention to the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which, as I understand it, we have a disadvantage in terms of how this has been established for the UK. It's due to be introduced on the 1st of January 2027, later than in the EU, which is clearly a disadvantage to UK producers. Can you update the House on what he plans to do?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that and for your very skillful introduction, Mr. Speaker, to him. He is right to talk about that wider business environment. He specifically asks about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. What we've inherited is the UK being out of line with the European Union, obviously because our carbon price is lower. There's a potential carbon barrier to UK exports into the single market as a result of that. I can tell him we are looking at that, and I do believe that carbon border adjustment mechanisms are a key part of a wider policy environment that must deliver decarbonisation, that is not deindustrialisation, and we have to recognise the current policy environment is not doing that in the way any of us would want to see.
Dame Priti Patel.
Mr. Speaker, I've listened to the statement from the Secretary of State with interest. Can he specifically say when the strategy will be published and brought to this House? Secondly, what level of government investment will be behind the strategy? And thirdly, what assurances is he able to give to steel workers across England, Port Talbot and Scunthorpe in particular, that their jobs are not going to be put at risk because of steel being dumped in the UK from China?
I'm grateful to her for her questions. The strategy will be in spring next year. The resources behind it, including the existing government allocation for Port Talbot and the new money the government will bring. It's a £3 billion clean steel fund, so it's a significant investment. Obviously, I want a certain amount of return for that. I want to work with private sector partners. A lot of the question here, the kind of capex that's involved in the transition to green steel requires very significant partners that can deliver. It's not just a question of can the government do this alone, and I think honourable members do recognise that. The issue of steel safeguards is very, very important. As you will know, steel is a significant part of the existing protections that are in place from the Trade Remedies Authority. Many of those do relate, though not exclusively, to China, but that is an important part of that, and we keep that under very regular review.
Catherine Fuchs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for today's announcement and reminding us of the role that steel plays in our green transition. He's done more in 2 months than the party opposite has done in 14 years. Many of my constituents in Monmouthshire work in the steel supply chain and in steel, especially in Caldicot and Chepstow. So can my right honourable friend recognise that your announcement today has ramifications for the whole of South Wales?
So stay.
Well, I thank her very much for her question, Mr. Speaker. I do believe, I'll say again, I wish we were in a position to do even more, but I can tell honourable members across the House, I believe this is the maximum improvement that was possible within 2 months. And I know in constituencies like hers, what people are seeking more than anything else is a recognition that steel is not some sort of sunset industry. It is vital to the future. It is not the case that it should be in inevitable decline in the UK. We are an outlier indeed in terms of the size of our steel industry compared to comparable G7 and OECD countries. So this could be and should be a very positive story, and I am honestly confident we can deliver that in future.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The right honourable gentleman mentions quite clearly procurement, and one of the issues that's taken place over countless years is statements and new strategies on how we deal with steelmaking. Can he set out his plans to ensure that there's a long-term order book for steelmaking in this country so that the investors can make sure that they're getting value for money as well as the taxpayer, and equally how he will endeavour to use the public purse to purchase British steel, at the same time encouraging British steel to be exported in other parts of the world?
I'm grateful to him for his question. Yes, I very much agree. As an opposition Shadow Secretary of State, I used to avidly read the statistics the department already publishes about UK content in domestic steel procurement. I think one of the issues we've got to recognise is that is actually usually relatively high, but only in the sectors where we are producing the particular grades of steel. I think part of the strategy has to look at future demand, not just in terms of what we already produce, but where are there gaps, where are there business opportunities. If we're improving the business environment, not just in terms of helping incumbent producers within the United Kingdom transition, but bringing in new entrants, more competition in the market. I do, whenever I look at this, see very clearly there is significant demand in the market. It is the market that is driving the demand for green steel. So I have no concerns about the future order book, but it's the business environment to take advantage of that demand that this strategy needs to address.
Torsten Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for his statement and for all his hard work in recent months. And it's clear that the delays in the negotiations have had a very real price. And when I was visiting Port Talbot on Friday, what the workers and the management want to know is those delays have now come to an end. So can he reassure this House that we will do everything we can to make sure that the construction now does get going on the future of this plant?
Well, I thank him for his question and for recently visiting the site to speak to management and the workforce. He is right about, understandably, the level of concern that has existed in the workforce when this is obviously something that is often speculated on in the media. There's a huge amount of interest in it, and I understand that. But one of the reasons to make this statement today, Mr. Speaker, is obviously because of the need to proceed with part of the plan and not lose everything entirely, but also to be able to put and answer questions like this and make clear that the government's commitment in our manifesto to that steel transition fund is not only there, but it forms part of a wider ambition, a coherent strategy for the future of steel across every bit of the UK.
Dennis Medic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The loss of virgin steel production in Wales is a serious economic blunder and will devastate the community of Port Talbot. Unions have previously called for additional investment of £683 million in Port Talbot to save jobs. Meanwhile, in Germany, they have invested €1.3 billion in decarbonising steel in one region alone this year. Can the Secretary of State explain why he won't match the ambition of the workers here and governments of other countries to save the Welsh steel?
Well, I'd say in response to her question, the level of ambition and the level of resource we have as a new government is actually greater than the figures that she just gave. But what you need to do the kind of work that she is describing is you need a private sector partner. The government cannot meet the capex needs of this alone, and indeed, to be successful, it is better to work with a private sector partner to deliver it. So if I had a partner to retain virgin steel production, that's part of what the strategy will be able to address, or if I had a partner willing to keep blast furnaces open, I'm of course very interested within that. But what I don't want to do is spend this very large sum of money of our Clean Steel Fund on subsidising operating losses for maybe 1 or 2 years, which would eat up most of that £3 billion, and then be left with nothing at the end of it. I want to co-invest with the private sector for good, secure, long-term jobs, which are much in demand. But the level of resource and of ambition of this new government is in excess. She's right to say other European countries have been way ahead of the UK in the last few years, but the level of ambition from this government not only matches, it exceeds some of those European competitors.
Stephen Liddell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What discussions has he had with the workforce and their unions about this improved deal?
Well, I thank him for his question. The answer is a great many, as he will understand, but I've always been conscious, not just of the specific impact on the workforce at Port Talbot, but also in terms of what I have often said, which is I believe some of the big industrial transitions of the past in the United Kingdom, where I grew up in the northeast of England, were not handled well. I think people recognise, I thought the previous government's levelling up strategy in a sense was a recognition of the long-term damage that was done in the late 80s and early 90s in terms of that transition not being done well. So getting that right and showing the workforce that this is a government that cares has always been paramount. I've been to Port Talbot myself several times. I last met, I think, the community reps just a week ago and was able to have those frank conversations with them. That is why in everything I have said and will continue to say, I recognise I wish we were in a position to do more, but within the parameters of what we had and where we almost were in terms of the entire loss of the site. In these 2 months, I'm confident in saying this is the biggest improvement that was possible, and we will always work with them to ensure we're getting everything we can for the site.
Dr. Andrew Mason.
The wholesale price for electricity in this country is already pretty much the highest in Europe, and it will probably get worse as we shift towards renewables, with the possibility of outages and intermittency. That means electric arc furnaces are going to become more expensive. What is he doing to ensure that suppliers perfectly legitimately turn to China for its virgin steel produced in dirty blast furnaces?
Well, as he will know, this has long been something that has been a campaigning issue of mine. I've talked repeatedly about the relationship between decarbonisation and the potential for deindustrialisation and the policy environment in this country not being fit for purpose to deliver that. Specifically when it comes to the wholesale electricity prices energy-intensive industries have, For most of the last government, yes, the UK's prices were wildly uncompetitive. There was some movement, as he knows, with the supercharger policy near the end. I think there is more that can be done. I think there is an even more exciting longer-term position that we could get to. You'll have to wait to the budget review, the budget and maybe the spending review for some more details of that. But in terms of the competitiveness of the UK, this has got to be an essential issue and priority, and we've got to recognise a lot of the industries we will transition to are very heavy users of electricity, not just clean steel, but in terms of, for instance, gigafactories, and this will be a key tool in future that we have to do better on than we had in the last 14 years.
Leicester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on securing this improved deal? I know just how hard he has worked over many years, not just in the short term before the election and since the election that he referred to in his answer to the Shadow Minister. And on the subject of procurement, can he say whether there is going to be a presumption in favour of using British-produced steel in both nationally significant projects in green energy, but also in defence, which is in stark contrast to what the previous government did, in particular with the Fleet Solid Support contract?
My honourable friend for his comments. Indeed, if I could thank him for all of his support in those years in opposition when we were tackling many of these issues. He asked specifically about procurement. Of course, anything we do as a government would be consistent with our international trade rules and our commitments to open markets and multilateralism. But when you consider the legitimate way you can consider social value in government procurement, also when you look at the value and the quality of the product we produce in the UK, I am very, very confident in procurement playing a bigger part in the future of the steel industry. And specifically in relation to defence, neither Scunthorpe or Port Talbot, in terms of the blast furnaces, play a direct role in some of the key MOD contracts, as Sheffield's Forge Masters, that plays more of a role within there. I do therefore think there are more capacities, again, more capabilities we can look to as a country for opportunities in future.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The truth is, and the country needs to know this, that the thousands of jobs and the loss of these blast furnaces announced today is because of both main parties' obsession with net zero. That is the truth. And the reality is blast furnaces have been losing money because of high energy costs caused by the very expensive renewable energy. But, Mr. Speaker, we are where we are, and I'd like to ask the Secretary of State to give this House a guarantee that in the event that Tata do not build the electric arc furnaces that are being promised, will he guarantee this House that the taxpayers' money will be returned to the taxpayer?
Secretary of State.
Well, I have to tell the honourable member that I'm afraid he's misinformed as to what this is about. The issue here is these sites lose approximately £1 million a day. And they've done so for a long period of time, and the owners are fed up, and they want to know there'll be a plan for the future. And therefore, the role of government is to make that a better future than it would otherwise be were we not on the pitch delivering that. There are issues around the competitive cost of industrial electricity in the UK. They are, in many ways, they're not the issues the honourable member is saying. But specifically in relation to the guarantee he is seeking, he will have heard my statement. Yes, Mr. Speaker, the contractual terms of the grant funding arrangement include that clawback capacity, not just in terms of the overall project, but specifically even down to the number of jobs per job. And that is the kind of job guarantees I want in the public-private relationship going forward.
Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my honourable friend's commitment to introducing a new steel strategy. Steel is not a sunset industry. It's critical for our economy and for our national security as well. I know he is a friend of Teesside, and I wonder if he can give us some clarity on the status of discussions around investment in steel in Teesside at the moment.
My honourable friend very much, and he is absolutely right to make that point, which we cannot say enough, that this is not a sunset industry. It should have a bright future. We can get this right. Specifically in relation to the negotiations with British Steel, Mr. Speaker, the honourable friend will know what I've already said in terms of the conversations with them. It is, again, a very, very challenging issue. We have made clear that government is there to play a part. We obviously want that to be part of a transition. We've made that as clear as can be, and as soon as we have further information, I will, of course, update honourable members and the House as a whole.
Victor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State for his statements. I'm a supporter of industrial strategy, and I welcome the idea of a steel strategy in the future. I would just want to ask a couple of specific questions of detail. Firstly, is it the government's policy that the domestic manufacture of primary steel is a strategic industry that must be protected and guaranteed? What does the government intend to do about the sourcing, either domestically or through import, of coking coal? And earlier, he seemed to suggest that he wouldn't be intervening to support British Steel in Scunthorpe. And can he confirm if that is the case, and we do lose that capacity, then the country may go through 5, 6, 7 or so years without steel manufacture in this country?
Well, I thank him for his question and very much welcome his support for industrial strategy. I've said many times there should be, and is in many countries, a cross-party agreement, perhaps not on the detail, but on the premise and what we are trying to achieve with it. He asks about the domestic manufacture, the blast furnaces remaining open. That is, of course, my preference, but I need a business partner to do that. I need a company that's willing to do that. I cannot, and I think it would be reasonable to spend the very considerable sum of money we have pledged for this on subsidising those short-term losses over the ability to deliver new things. He asks about coking coal. Well, obviously that's dependent on the long-term future of the blast furnaces. That is what they need. Specifically in relation to British Steel is what I'm saying. I want a transition plan. The specific comments earlier on my frustration that for me the ideal deal in a place like Scunthorpe would have been to build the future alongside operating what we currently have, and that was available to the last government. They didn't proceed with it. The kind of infrastructure needed for the long-term future of operating blast furnaces would require carbon capture and storage, cancelled many times by the previous government, not in there. So I'm heavily constrained by my options, but still doing everything I can to get a deal for the workforce there and to make sure there is a business there commanding the support of its customers to transition in future.
Pamela Nash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the Secretary of State for this announcement today of the steel strategy and commend him for managing to do so in such a short period in office. And it's something that the industry has been crying out for a very long time, and the party opposite just failed the industry without doing this. I'd like the Secretary of State to say a bit more about what his hopes are for what the strategy can achieve for the steel industry throughout the UK, and in particular in my constituency in Motherwell.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to her and thank her for her comments. I think, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the opportunities for the future, particularly in terms of renewables, of some of the steels that will be necessary in terms of the automotive sector, of some of the new technologies that are being taken up around other European countries, particularly the excitement around direct reduced iron. I do think there are future opportunities. I think how we deliver the business environment and hopefully the new partners or the existing partners to deliver that is absolutely key, and I hope that is what the strategy will deliver.
Jessica Morgan.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State for this statement today, which absolutely shows the priority this government is putting on steel, which is in direct contrast to the last government, who had absolutely no industrial strategy, and it's a real treat to hear the Minister suggest otherwise earlier. Can I ask him to say a little bit more about the plans for Llanwern? We've got a really dedicated workforce there who've been through hard times recently. With support, Llanwern can turn into the finest automotive finishing line in the world. Can he commit to develop that and safeguard the future of the plant?
Thank my honourable friend for her question, and I say again, there was, and there would have been, had the election perhaps not been called, a scenario where a statement like this would not have been possible. This would have gone, this would have passed by. That was the situation that we faced. Now, she correctly talks with pride about her constituents at Llanwern, an incredibly important and successful part of our industrial supply chain in the United Kingdom, and obviously particularly important to Wales. I will make sure, as part of the transition, that of course the downstream functions, which are so valuable and so praised and carry such respect in the industry, are protected, and that the transition plan does not disrupt the business model, which again is proof of the success of the sector and the opportunities in future.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State very much for the statement today, and I very much welcome the endeavours that the Secretary of State is making to have a firm foundation for this sector as it moves forward. I recognise that, I think we all do, Mr Speaker. And also I recognise the Minister's commitment to Harland and Wolff, as he referred to in the statement that he made. This is indeed great news for not simply the workers but also for the construction sector in Northern Ireland. However, the problem that the steel industry faces is that of affordable energy. The Secretary of State mentioned that in his introduction. How will the Secretary of State confirm the long-term sustainability of this and other industries by addressing the energy price crisis immediately, as well as with the necessary but long-term green energy fixes? Thank you.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to the honourable member for his support for what we have been able to announce today. In terms of the competitive environment, this is an absolutely key issue. I believe, and I'm already having extensive conversations with the Chancellor and with my key cabinet colleagues, such as the Secretary of State for Energy and Net Zero, about the way to do that, both in terms of the short term and the longer term, where we will clearly in future be in a position with a very significant renewable energy base, how we use some of that capacity in areas of low consumer demand. There are lots of exciting options available, and I can tell them it's a key priority for getting this right in future.
Alan Gavin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to congratulate my right honourable friend for the deal he's announced today and say, as a former British Trade Commissioner to India, this, I assure him, is a better deal from a better and more serious government than the one that we saw opposite. I wondered if you could tell the House what direct conversations he's had with Tata about future investments in the UK.
Secretary of State. Grateful to him, and indeed I want to put on the record that whilst I know the workforce at times have been frustrated with the plans of Tata, I understand why Tata themselves were frustrated with the previous government and how long that took to do. I've had extensive conversations with Tata in opposition to build the kind of relationship that I think has been necessary to deliver something like this, whether that is meeting the Executive Chair, Chandra, first at Davos, then I flew to Mumbai, colleagues might remember, to build that relationship. I actually saw him yesterday because he was in the United Kingdom alongside the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. So we're continuing to have these conversations and working with all partners to deliver the kind of opportunities we think will be available in the UK in future.
That completes the statement. I'll let the front benches change over. We now come to the next statement. I call the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Hilary Benn.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I would like to make a statement about the death of Patrick Finucane. Patrick Finucane was a human rights lawyer. On the 12th of February 1989, he was brutally murdered in his home in North Belfast by loyalist paramilitary group the Ulster Defence Association in front of his wife Geraldine, who was wounded, and his 3 children, one of whom is now the Honourable Member for Belfast North. From that day onwards, Mrs Finucane and her family have campaigned tirelessly in search of answers about the killing of their loved one. In 1990, an inquest was opened and closed on the same day with an open verdict. Subsequently, a number of investigations and reviews were conducted. In 2001, following the collapse of power sharing, the UK and Irish governments agreed at Weston Park to establish public inquiries into a number of Troubles-related cases if recommended by an international judge. Judge Peter Corey was appointed to conduct a review of each case, and in 2004 he recommended that the UK government hold public inquiries into 4 deaths, those of Rosemary Nelson, Robert Hamill, Billy Wright and Patrick Finucane. Judge Corey also recommended that the Irish government establish a tribunal of inquiry into the deaths of former RUC officers Bob Buchanan and Harry Breen. Inquiries were promptly established in all of these cases, with one exception: the death of Mr Finucane. Meanwhile, in 2003, the 3rd investigation by Sir John Stevens into alleged collusion between the security forces and loyalist paramilitaries had concluded that there had been state collusion in Mr Finucane's killing. That investigation was followed by the conviction in 2004 of one of those responsible, Ken Barrett. With criminal proceedings concluded, the then Northern Ireland Secretary, Paul Murphy, made a statement to Parliament setting out the government's commitment to establish an inquiry. But despite a number of attempts, the government was unable to reach agreement with the Finucane family on arrangements for one. In 2011, the coalition government decided against an inquiry. Instead, a review of what had happened, led by Sir Desmond de Silva QC, was established. Sir Desmond concluded that he was left, and I quote, "in no doubt that agents of the state were involved in carrying out serious violations of human rights up to and including murder." The publication of his findings in 2012 led the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, to make an unprecedented apology from this dispatch box to the Finucane family on behalf of the British government, citing the, and I quote, "shocking levels of state collusion," end of quote, in this case. In 2019, the Supreme Court found that all the previous investigations had been insufficient to enable the state to discharge its obligations under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The court identified a number of deficiencies in the state's compliance with Article 2. In particular, Sir Desmond's review did not have the power to compel the attendance of witnesses. Those who met Sir Desmond were not subject to testing as to the accuracy of their evidence, and a potentially critical witness was excused from attendance. In November 2020, the then Secretary of State for Northern Ireland announced that he would not be establishing a public inquiry at that time, pending the outcome of continuing investigations. But that decision was quashed by the Northern Ireland High Court in December 2022. Mr. Speaker, this government takes its human rights obligations and its responsibilities to victims and survivors of the Troubles extremely seriously. And the plain fact is that 2 decades on, the commitment made by the government, first in the agreement with the Irish government and then to this House to establish an inquiry into the death of Mr. Finucane, remains unfulfilled. It is for this exceptional reason that I have decided to establish an independent inquiry into the death of Patrick Finucane under the 2005 Inquiries Act. I have, of course, met Mrs. Finucane and her family, first on the 25th of July to hear their views, and again yesterday to inform them of my decision. Mrs. Finucane asked the government to set up a public inquiry under the 2005 Act, and as I've just told the House, the government has now agreed to do that in line with both the 2019 Supreme Court ruling and the Court of Appeal judgment in July this year. In making this decision, I have, as is required, considered the likely costs and impact on the public finances. It is the government's expectation that the inquiry will, while doing everything that is required to discharge the state's human rights obligations, avoid unnecessary costs given all the previous reviews and investigations and the large amount of information and material that is already in the public domain. Indeed, in the most recent High Court proceedings, the judge suggested that an inquiry could, and I quote, build on the significant investigative foundations which are already in place. Mr. Speaker, as part of my decision-making process, I did also consider whether to refer this case to the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery. The Commission has powers comparable to those provided by the Inquiries Act to compel witnesses and to secure the disclosure of relevant documents by state bodies, powers identified by the Supreme Court as being crucial for the government to discharge its human rights obligations. The Commission was found in separate proceedings in February this year by the High Court to be sufficiently independent and capable of conducting Article 2 compliant investigations. And while I am committed to considering measures to further strengthen the Commission, I have every confidence in its ability under the leadership of Sir Declan Morgan to find answers for survivors and families. However, given the unique circumstances of this case and the solemn commitment made by the government in 2001 and again in 2004, the only appropriate way forward is to establish a public inquiry. Mr. Speaker, many of us in this House remember the savage brutality of the Troubles, a truly terrible time in our history, and we must never forget that most of the deaths and injuries were the responsibility of paramilitaries, including the Ulster Defence Association, the Provisional IRA and others. And we should also always pay tribute to the work during that time of the armed forces, the police, the security services, the vast majority of whom served with distinction and honour, and so many of whom sacrificed their lives in protecting others. It is very hard for any of us to understand fully the trauma of those who lost loved ones, sons and daughters, spouses and partners, fathers and mothers, and what they have been through. And there is, of course, nothing that any of us can do to bring them back or to erase the deep pain that was caused. But what we can do is to seek transparency, to help provide answers to families, and to work together for a better future for Northern Ireland, which has made so much progress since these terrible events. I hope that this inquiry will finally provide the information that the Finucane family has sought for so long. The government will seek to appoint a chair of the inquiry and establish its terms of reference as soon as possible, and I will update the House further. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Right, we come to the Shadow Secretary of State, Alex Burke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State for his statement and for advance sight of this statement and for the courtesy call that he made me this morning. I'm particularly grateful to him for bringing this statement forward before recess. I know that the deadline that the court gave him was the 27th of September, and so it was very important that we had a chance to hear the government's position and ask questions before we rose for conference recess. The murder of Patrick Finucane, like so many murders during the Troubles, was a dreadful act of violence which must not be forgotten. The opposition stands by the findings of the 2012 De Silva report that whilst there was no evidence of an overarching state conspiracy in the case of his murder, there were shocking levels of collusion, something for which the then Prime Minister, now Lord Cameron, rightly apologised to the House in that year. I fully appreciate the Secretary of State's desire to bring this matter to a close after a very long period, and I know that a full public inquiry will do it. But I do wish to ask questions, serious questions, about the decision to choose a full public inquiry over one of the alternatives that he mentioned. It is clear that the Finucane family, who have suffered so much, are owed a further and deeper investigation. And that much was made clear by the Supreme Court's finding in February in 2019, when the court noted that the De Silva report had not been able to compel witnesses or take its evidence in public. In other words, it had not been Article 2 compliant. But as the Secretary of State said, this year the Belfast High Court concluded that the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, the ICRIR, was capable of conducting such an investigation which was Article 2 compliant and was sufficiently independent to do so. So my first question to him this afternoon is that given that the ICRIR has powers to compel witnesses and take evidence in public, what is it that a full public inquiry will be able to do that the ICRIR cannot? This is important because the ICRIR is already fully staffed and active. It could begin work quickly, whereas the establishment of a full public inquiry, the building of that team, will inevitably take time. So given the opportunity for further delay, Can I ask him to set out for the House what steps he is taking to ensure that this public inquiry is conducted as quickly as possible? Can he give an undertaking to have appointed a chair and agreed terms of reference before the end of the year, say? I noted in his statement that he referred to the High Court proceedings where the judge suggested that an inquiry could build on the significant investigative foundations which are already in place. I hope that will mean that we can have terms of reference relatively fast. Similarly, in his conversations with his Right Honourable friend the Chancellor, has he set an expectation of time and costs? We know from previous public inquiries that unless these things are considered early on, the inquiries can take a long time and cost a great deal. On the issue of the ICRI itself, I've been very pleased to hear that the Commission has his confidence. We agree that it's showing itself to be an excellent and effective body with a highly capable chair. I would note that it was also the creation of the previous government, created, as he will know, by the Legacy and Reconciliation Act, which his government has committed to repeal. Indeed, the House will want to appreciate that a very large part of that legislation is given over to the creation of the ICRI. So can I ask him to reassure us that he has no intention of repealing that part of the Legacy and Reconciliation Act? Returning to the public inquiry that's just been announced, I think there's one other issue on which we should seek clarity today. He referred in his statement to the unique circumstances of this case. I think it's very important that we understand exactly what those unique circumstances are. This is because, Madam Deputy Speaker, it's very important that the government does not unwittingly set a precedent for many more public inquiries. I'm a veteran of the Cabinet Office, and whilst I was there, I became acutely aware that there's a danger that public inquiries could cease to be the exception and become the rule. Given that there are thought to be thousands of murders from the Troubles still unsolved, there is a risk, I think, of setting a precedent that would make inquiries the rule, because there will be those who say if there is to be a full public inquiry in one murder case, why not in another? Why not indeed in many others? To avoid that happening, if this case is, as he says, genuinely unique, the government, I think, has a responsibility to set out why it is. We must not risk turning the system of public inquiries into a more routine process. I'm sure that the Right Honourable Gentleman will feel the same way, and I ask him to make that commitment. I thank him for a statement.
Okay.
Well, I'm very grateful to the opposition spokesperson for his opening remarks. And can I respond directly to the very legitimate questions that he has put? What is unique about this case, and I apologise for the length of the opening statement, but I thought it was really important to take the House through the history. What is unique about it is the commitment given on two previous occasions by the government of our country that there would be a public inquiry. And it sets no precedent, to come to his last question. It sets no precedent, but there were exceptional circumstances relating to this case which has led me to take this decision. I will, of course, especially as the Finucane family have been waiting 35 years, seek to establish the inquiry as quickly as possible, have to appoint, of course, a judge. The judge then has to be consulted by myself about the terms of reference. The time it will take will depend on how the inquiry unfolds. I am acutely conscious of cost, and the Honourable Gentleman makes an extremely fair point, which is why it seems to me, given all the material and information that's already out there, what the inquiry can most usefully do is not seek to go over all of that, but to interrogate the information and the material and witnesses as necessary, because that is, as the Supreme Court made clear, what has been missing that led them to conclude that this was not Article 2 compliant. Look, we have a commitment to repeal and replace the Legacy Act, and we will be beginning that process shortly in finally laying to rest the conditional immunity. The Honourable Gentleman would have heard what the government has said about civil cases and inquests. On the independent commission, I've been very clear when I was in this role in opposition and since taking up the office of Secretary of State that while we want to return to the principles of the Stormont House Agreement, that said, there needs to be information recovery, there needs to be continuing investigation. It did, it's true, envisage two separate bodies. Those functions are combined in ICRA. And I've been very frank in saying I don't see the point. Now it's been established, all the staff appointed, I really don't see the point in abolishing it, only to recreate something that looks very much like what we have today. So it's a pragmatic decision that I've taken. Now, I also made clear in my statement that I'm committed to considering further steps to strengthen its independence and its powers as necessary. I hope that provides the honourable gentleman with the reassurance he was looking for.
Colm Eastwood.
Madam Deputy Speaker, on the 17th of January 1989, Conservative Minister Douglas Hogg claimed in Parliament that solicitors in Northern Ireland were unduly sympathetic to the cause of the IRA. MP Seamus Mallon responded that he had no doubt that there are lawyers walking in the streets or driving the roads of the north of Ireland who have become targets for assassins' bullets as a result of that statement that has just been made tonight. 3 weeks later, lawyer Pat Finucane was shot 14 times and murdered in his own house in front of his wife and 3 children. Can I commend Geraldine Finucane and the Finucane family, including, of course, the member for North Belfast, for the tireless campaigning that they've done to get to this point. And can I thank the Secretary of State for finally doing the right thing on behalf of the British Government and announcing this inquiry. Can I ask him, when does he envisage this inquiry beginning?
Secretary of State.
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his words. I mean, he alludes to a very, very unhappy history in this and many, many other cases, because I do take the point that the honourable member who just questioned me said about all of the pain and suffering that all families have experienced. But because of this particular case, I've decided this is the right thing to do, and I'm grateful to the honourable member for his appreciation.
James McCleary.
Deputy Speaker, thank you, Secretary of State. The murder of Patrick Finucane remains a shocking crime, even now, 35 years on, and even in the context of so many tragedies that took place during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I'm sure everyone in the House, like me's thoughts are with the family of Patrick Finucane, who have suffered for so long waiting for answers after that terrible day. And I hope that the independent inquiry announced by the Secretary of State will go some way to bringing some closure, at least, for the family after all these decades. The Liberal Democrats welcome the Secretary of State's statement and the announcement of the independent inquiry. But I'd like to ask the Secretary of State whether he agrees with me that there is a need to acknowledge the wider need for truth and justice in Northern Ireland, in contrast to the honourable member, the Shadow Secretary of State. I'd like to ask if he would come to the House with a wider statement on repealing the Legacy and Reconciliation Act that, of course, the Liberal Democrats opposed in the last Parliament, and talk more widely about the role of legacy in Northern Ireland, which is, of course, so important. I'd also, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Secretary of State for clarification on the ability of this inquiry to compel documents and witnesses, and, like others, ask about the timescales of the inquiry, which I'm sure he will agree that Patrick Finucane's family have waited long enough already.
State.
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his welcome for the inquiry, and I'm very happy to give him and all members of the House an assurance that as we develop our proposals, I'm in the process of talking to lots of people about how to give effect to the repeal and replace commitment that there was in the King's the gracious speech, and I will, of course, come back to the House with proposals in due course and keep the House informed. The honest answer to the question he has put and other members have put is I want to get on with this as soon as possible, but I have certain duties I have to undertake in order to give effect to it. But after this long period of time, let's get going with this as soon as we possibly can.
Claire Hanna.
The brutal murder of Pat Finucane in front of his wife and children was mired in collusion before that killing and in the many long years since. Today is about the tenacity of the Finucane family, including my constituency neighbour John Finucane, but it will have resonance for many other victims of the Troubles whose needs have for many years been put behind the needs of the victim makers who want the truth to remain covered up. And I'm so glad that the truth may now finally out for this family. The Secretary of State will know that many other families have faced obstruction from state and non-state actors in their quest for truth and a reconciled future. I'm thinking of families like those victims of Freddie Scappaticci, like the family of Sean Brown and many, many others. Will the Secretary of State now commit to the same swiftness and determination to removing the barriers that are placed in front of those families in their quest for truth?
State.
Well, I would say to the honourable member that each case, and she alludes to some of them, and we are, of course, awaiting the final report of Operation Canova, the interim report having been published early this year. I undertake and make a commitment, as any holder of this office would do, to carefully consider each individual case and reach what I think is a sensible way forward. But we have a huge task, all of us, collectively, to play our part in enabling families to find out answers that they haven't yet had. And in that context, I have to say I welcome the announcement by ICRA on Monday of this week that they'd had 85 inquiries and have already agreed to start looking into 8 cases. And I think that is significant, because there are those who say no one should go anywhere near ICRA because of its origins and parentage, if I may use that phrase. But having taken the decision that it will remain in place, it does have powers, it does have the ability to get information, it does have the ability to question people. It has said that it wants to develop a system of they call enhanced inquisitorial procedure, which is public hearings. And of course, hearings in public are really important to many families because they want the truth to come out, to be able to question, but crucially, for justice to be seen to be done.
Julian Smith.
Can I press the Secretary of State further on this issue of other families? Months ago, they saw, with the previous government, a bill, which I did not support, repressing and restricting their ability to have inquests in that bill. Today, they now see a full public inquiry for another family. Could he update the House on what personal engagement he will do? Because I think inevitably those families are going to say, we've got a public inquiry here, and then we're being asked to wait in the queue on this legacy bill inquest body, and they will think there is something that isn't right about that.
Secretary of State.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman who was such a distinguished holder of this office for raising that point. I have met in the past 3 weeks a number of those families whose inquests were brought to an end, both because of the May the 1st portcullis that came down that brought an end to the inquest, and others because the coroners had said, we don't think we can take this any further because of issues to do with confidential material. And I undertake to the House to reach a decision in those cases and to inform the families as quickly as possible. One of the reasons why we made the commitment in relation to the Legacy Act is, and I've said this before, what is it about this part of our United Kingdom that citizens should be denied the right to bring a civil case, which is what the Act did, denied the right to have an inquest? That cannot be right and proper, and that's why this government has made that commitment.
Adam Jogi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Secretary of State's statement today, and I'm sure all colleagues give thanks that Northern Ireland and its people now live in peace. Can the Secretary of State tell us how he thinks this announcement today will help contribute to the continued and meaningful reconciliation in Northern Ireland?
Well, for one family, it now provides a process. But look, I am very, very conscious that there are many other families who will say, what about us? What about us? And that is why we need to to find the most effective means in order to get to the truth. And that is part of the reason, as I've already explained, why I decided that we would not get rid of the Commission. And I have met Sir Declan Morgan a number of times, and I have confidence in his ability to do his work. And we have to find practical means of providing answers to all of those families so that they feel that their story can be told and they can get what they have been looking for. The point I wish to emphasise again to the House today is this particular case is exceptional for the reasons that I set out in my statement.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the things the Secretary of State did not outline in his statement was that the Supreme Court considered whether it was appropriate not to proceed with a public inquiry, and the Supreme Court agreed, provided an investigation could satisfy Article 2 compliance. And he has said today that the ICRIR not only has his trust and confidence, but has the ability to perform such tasks for other families. So when he rightly says families across Northern Ireland will ask the question, what about us? So too do I. Because the most exceptional circumstance around this is the exceptionality of treatment. Over 1,200 families still have neither truth nor justice. And if the plans that were enacted last year continue, then they will never get justice. But I would ask him, in repudiating the ICRIR, in suggesting today that it is not an appropriate mechanism for the Finucane family, and I do not besmirch their grief or their quest for truth and justice, but it is appropriate for every other. How can he honestly look victims in the eye and say that there isn't a hierarchy?
Well, there should not be a hierarchy, and the Right Honourable Gentleman and I both shared reservations, indeed opposition, to the Legacy Act, because it did cut off lots of routes to justice. And in the end, I think families should have the opportunity to avail themselves of inquests and civil cases. The Commission is now in existence. The honest answer to his question is that in this particular case, and that doesn't apply to any of the others, the government of our country made a commitment twice. Once at Weston Park, and secondly by the then Secretary of State, made a commitment to establish a public inquiry. And I think it's right and proper, a government in the past having made that commitment, that we honour it. And that is the answer I would give him.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The state's collusion in the murder of a human rights lawyer in front of his wife and children, what an incredibly serious matter which chills us all. So I very much welcome the decision by my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, for a public inquiry into the murder of Pat Finucane. It's a decision to be welcomed. It's a good signal from our new government that it's meeting its commitments and obligations. But of course, this very welcome announcement must be followed by the action that the Secretary of State has rightly outlined. So can my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, give further reassurance to this House that all necessary resources will be provided so that there can be truth and justice in this incredibly important matter?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend and neighbour for what he has just said. Look, having made this decision, I think all of us would recognise the need to get on with it as swiftly as possible.
Sammy Wilson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a bad decision today. It will cause anger and further hurt for the many hundreds of families who have not had justice for the murder of their loved ones, including the mass murder of Protestant workmen at King's Mills, the blowing up of Protestant workmen at T-Ban, and the horrendous murder of worshippers at Tullyvallen, amongst others. And I think that the Secretary of State has to explain to the House why, after tens of millions of pounds have been spent on inquiries and reviews of this case, he still believes that it is necessary to acquiesce to the demands of the family in having another inquiry. And how does he justify to the hundreds of families that there will be no such resources placed in seeking out the truth about the murders of their family members? And given the record of inquiries of this nature being golden goose for barristers and solicitors in Northern Ireland, how is he going to ensure that the costs are capped?
Well, the first thing I would say to the honourable member, and as he recounts some of the terrible murders, and I have myself met the only survivor, as I'm sure other members have, of the Kingsmill massacre and heard firsthand the truly chilling story of what happened on that day. I would say, first of all, considerable resources are now being given to the Independent Commission. And it's important to recognise that, because it has a huge task on its hands. I hope that others will come forward to the Commission to avail themselves of what it can offer. That is the first point I would make. The second is, and I have said it to other members in answering their questions, in this particular case, there was a commitment that was made twice. And I think it's important that we honour it. And we also have to recognise, in this particular case, the court found that all of the investigations, and I accept what he said about them and the extent, and of course they involved the expenditure of public monies, the court held in 2019 that that did not meet the requirements of Article 2. And faced with that, faced with the quashing at the end of 2022 of the decision of a previous Secretary of State not to call an inquiry pending further investigations, it has fallen to me to look at this and to decide how we're going to go forward, and I've set out my reasons as clearly as I can hope to do.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I clarify from the Secretary of State that he has now ended any opportunity from those families, those loved ones who still held out a hope for an inquiry into the death and the murder of their loved ones at the hands of terrorists across Northern Ireland? And he is now saying today that the only opportunity for them is to go to the Independent Commission for Reconciliation and Information Recovery, an organisation that doesn't have the full support of the communities of Northern Ireland and doesn't have the support and is queried under many of the families who have lost loved ones. Can I just seek clarity from the Secretary of State that he is saying to those families that their only opportunity for truth, recovery and justice is to go through this organisation, and he will not engage with them in regards to a further inquiry?
Secretary of State.
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that it should not be the only opportunity open to them, the Independent Commission. And that is why I've already indicated that this government will restore civil cases, and we will restore inquests in the first instance in those cases where they've been brought to an end by the Legacy Act. Because I agree with him, it would be quite wrong if one was to say there's only one route, denying people, families, the rights to inquests and civil cases that apply in all other parts of the United Kingdom. That was one of the things about the Legacy Act that was so profoundly wrong. It said, not we're going to establish a new body and you can use that route, but you also have the other two inquest and civil cases that have been available to you thus far. It shut those down as part of the reason why the Legacy Act was so widely opposed in Northern Ireland. Now, I must be honest that it will take time, obviously, because it will require primary legislation to deal with that bit of the Legacy Act that stopped the inquests and the civil cases, and that will flow from the consultation that I'm currently undertaking.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank the Secretary of State for the statement today? And I think we should all put on record our thanks to the member for Belfast North and his mother Geraldine and all of the Finucane family that have campaigned for so long, and so many others, for this inquiry to take place. I recognise the difficulties in prescribing what an inquiry should do, the cost of it and the length of time it would take. But is the Secretary of State in a position to tell us roughly when he would expect to establish the inquiry in its formal setting? And is he able to put some kind of outline timetable on it as to how long it should take to bring about, hopefully, a resolution to the disgraceful murder of Pat Finucane all those years ago?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. As I've already indicated, I will seek to establish the inquiry as quickly as possible. How long it will take is ultimately in the hands of the judge when he or she is appointed.
Cannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for the statement today? As the Secretary of State understands, the Democratic Unionist Party stood against the legacy legislation in the interest of pursuing justice for victims. This indication today will give hope for families such as Kingsmill as an example. I had a debate in the Kingsmill massacre in the German debate in the last term of Parliament. On the 5th of January 1976, 48 years ago, 10 innocent men who just happened to be Protestants were murdered with weapons linked to 40 other serious Republican terrorist crimes over a 15-year period, and which indicated information was withheld by the Garda Síochána. Quite clearly, some of the Garda Síochána, Madam Deputy Speaker, had IRA sympathies, and it could be said that they were agents of the Republic of Ireland state by their very position. Secretary of State, will the families of those 10 innocent Protestant men be granted the same path to justice as the Finucane family? If there is no inquiry granted to Kingsmill, then it will be perceived, and indeed proven by the Secretary of State himself, that there is a two-tier state of justice of victims that has been clearly enshrined by this very government. How disappointing, how disgusting, and how angry that makes me.
State.
Well, I'm sorry to have disappointed the honourable member, and I've already indicated that having met the one survivor of the Kingsmill massacre, I have some appreciation of just what an appalling and brutal event that was at a time of many appalling and brutal murders. There has been an inquest which concluded recently and, as I recall, held the Provisional IRA responsible for that murder. If, and I'm sure the families want to proceed further, one of the options open to them is to go to the Independent Commission. But at the risk of repeating myself, I do need to point out that I have come to this conclusion because this particular case, the Finucane case, is exceptional for the reasons that I have tried to explain.
Minister.
Speaker, could I begin by apologising to the Secretary of State and the House for being absent at the beginning of his statement? Secretary of State, has there ever been a family given more preferential handling by government than the Finucane family? Prime Ministerial apology, multiple investigations, inquiries, and now a uncapped public inquiry. After that family had rejected previous government offers of inquiry. Isn't the takeaway, the tragic takeaway from the Secretary of State's statement today, that for innocent victims of the IRA, UVF and others, the ICIR is good enough for them, but it's not good enough for the Finucane family? Why is the Secretary of State perpetuating that odious hierarchy of victims?
State.
Well, I am not, is the answer. And I know that the honourable member was slightly late in coming into the chamber, and from the beginning, I set out my thought process, and he will have an opportunity to read my statement subsequently. The reasons why I've reached this decision were clearly set out by me. It is a fact that when the then Prime Minister David Cameron apologised from this dispatch box, it was unprecedented. It was, because he referred to shocking collusion in this case. And we should take that extremely seriously as members of this House, all of us who are committed to upholding our obligations, and faced with the circumstances of two promises to establish public inquiries. And I accept what he says about why it didn't happen after 2004, because of the stance that the Finucane family then took, which has now changed, but also because of the decision of the Supreme Court in 2019 that said, for all that has gone before, I'm afraid the state has not complied with its Article 2 obligations. We will now be doing so.
Thank you so much. That concludes that. I'll give the front benches a moment to change over. Presentation of Bill, Secretary Angela Rayner. Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Second reading tomorrow. Before we begin the general debate on building safety and resilience, I remind the House that on Wednesday last week, Mr. Speaker renewed the waiver in relation to matters sub judice in respect of the ongoing or adjourned Grenfell Tower inquests and cases relating to cladding. This is to allow debate to take place on the relevant policy matters, including the Phase 2 report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the government's response to it. The waiver does not permit discussion of the details of individual cases. I would remind honourable members of the likelihood that both civil and criminal proceedings in the courts might follow in the coming months and years. Members will want to take special care to avoid saying anything in this House, anything which could subsequently prejudice a future trial. I call the Minister to move. Yeah. Move. Just move. No. Who speaks? Minister Rashanara Ali.
Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise today to open this debate on the critical issues of building safety and resilience, following last week's publication of the Grenfell Inquiry's final report. Sir Martin Morbick's findings on a national tragedy that was entirely avoidable were devastating. And I'd like to begin by remembering the 72 people who died, 18 of them children, in the biggest loss of life in a residential fire since the Second World War, and by paying tribute to the bereaved, the survivors, and wider Grenfell community who have waited too long for the answers and justice they deserve. It is thanks to their tireless crusade for truth, accountability, and change that we are here today. Madam Deputy Speaker, the final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry represents a defining moment in the journey for justice. As Sir Martin stated, the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who are responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. It shines a light on a terrible culture within industry in the years leading up to the tragedy of putting profit before people and where safety took a back seat. It reveals a building safety system that was fundamentally broken, with deficiencies that went unchallenged by different governments. The consequences of these failures are still with us today. Too many buildings with unsafe cladding and a pace of remediation that has been too slow. We will consider all of the recommendations in detail, and we will respond within 6 months, listening to and engaging with the bereaved, survivors, and residents in the immediate community as part of that work. And we will update Parliament annually on progress against every commitment we make. As the Prime Minister said, there must be much more radical action to stop something like this from happening ever again. Madam Deputy Speaker, the recent fire in Dagenham showed us the dangers that many residents continue to face. As an MP for an East London constituency with among the most cladded high-rise blocks in the country, I have long campaigned for the urgent remediation of affected buildings. And I know that members across this House grapple with similar issues in their constituencies. I know how relentless the work can be for residents trying to get remediation started. I've seen that firsthand. Our constituents have to endure not only the fear and uncertainty of living with unsafe cladding, but they also face higher insurance premiums and service charges that go with it. The delays are holding people back. They cannot make future plans or get on with their lives. They live in fear. They feel stuck. Now, as Minister for Building Safety, I'm honoured to have the opportunity to work alongside the Deputy Prime Minister to get things right, to make things right, to ensure that last week's moment of truth becomes a legacy of change, so that no other community has to go through the suffering that they have faced. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will bring the full power of government to bear on this task. And above all, we will accelerate the pace of remediation and go further and faster to drive change across the industry. I give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Minister for giving way and thank him for what she's just said. In the remedial works that are going to be done, some of those will be in the public sector, most will be in the private sector. In many cases, residents are paying the price of this in very high insurance premiums, as she just rightly acknowledged. In the resolution of all this, could those residents who've suffered a great deal of stress and cost over the past few years expect some form of compensation for their losses because of the failure of government and the industry to undertake the proper remedial works?
Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable member for his question. We recognise the impact on those with high insurance premiums, and we will take action to protect them, and we'll have the necessary dialogue to address the points he makes in terms of making sure that there aren't high insurance premiums. I give way to...
I thank the Minister for giving way. Firefighters and the FBU need to be listened to, and the government needs to deliver the statutory advisory body to ensure that the lessons of Grenfell are learned. Does the Minister agree with me?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Member for her question. We have already had discussions with key stakeholders, including firefighters and the FEU, head of the FEU. We want to make sure we speak to all relevant stakeholders, because if we want to get this right, we need to work across a range of institutions to make sure we tackle the root causes of fire safety. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to focus on some of the numbers of properties that are affected. There are currently 4,630 residential buildings above 11 metres whose remediation is being monitored by my department. Half of them have seen remediation start, with 1,350 having completed remediation. But counting the buildings we know about is not enough. We estimate there are as many as 7,000 buildings that need remediation that have not yet applied for the cladding safety scheme. That is a maximum estimate. There may well be fewer, but those responsible for these buildings have no excuse for failing to apply, and we will work with regulators to make sure they are identified. We will ensure, if I can make a bit more progress, we will ensure dangerous buildings are found and dealt with. The money is there, the speed must increase. We are not leaving this task just to regulators. The government must do more, and this government will. I give way to my right honourable friend.
Thank the Minister for giving way, and I congratulate her on her position. It's absolutely right that government should be providing support, including financial support, to these buildings that need work done urgently. The difference, of course, is that for buildings in the social housing sector, the Building Safety Fund has a different set of rules and criteria to those in the private sector. When the Prime Minister spoke about Grenfell, he spoke about the discrimination and poor treatment of social housing tenants. Will the government rectify this by making social housing providers now equally eligible for help from the Building Safety Fund?
I thank my honourable friend for his work, and I served in the Communities and Housing Committee that he chaired many years ago and learnt a great deal from his work. And I look forward to working closely with him. The government has committed up to £400 million in grant funding for the removal of Grenfell-style cladding in the social sector, and social housing landlords can apply for the grant schemes in particular circumstances. But we are working with regulators in the sector to ensure social landlords assess the progress of remediation work. There is much to do, and I look forward to working with him on this and the wider agenda. If I can make a bit more progress, then I will take my honourable friend's intervention. Since 2017, some progress has been made, including the Building Safety Act, which we supported. But what is clear is the speed of work to fix unsafe cladding and the pace. It's not fast enough. The recent fires in Dagenham and Slough underline the vulnerabilities that persist in our built environment. Since coming into office, we have met with regulators and other industry partners to press for action to make buildings safe. And we are contacting all metro mayors in England to ask for their support in driving forward local remediation acceleration plans, working in partnership with regulators. I give way to my honourable.
Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on her position, which is one of the toughest jobs in government in trying to put right these wrongs, and I wish her all the best. One of the things that would help is to improve the skills throughput in the construction industry. In my constituency, only one large block has had its cladding complete removed, and they started right 5 years ago now, and it's taken that long to deal with it. So those that have had no work started are way behind, and one of the big breaks on this is skills in the construction industry. Could you tell us what the government's doing to improve and enhance skills in that sector?
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention. This is a really important agenda, and I'll say more about the remediation action plan and our response. The Prime Minister committed to making sure we respond to the recommendations of Phase 2 within 6 months, and we certainly will be looking at those recommendations and the points she makes, very important points that have been raised with me over the past 2 months, and I'm very familiar with the concerns she has, as I have raised them myself in opposition. I want to turn to enforcement action. Our message to building owners is clear. Those who fail to make their buildings safe will face enforcement action. The funding is there. The government has committed £5.1 billion to remove dangerous cladding, and industry is providing the rest. All blocks of residential flats above 11 metres now have access to a scheme to fix unsafe cladding. Qualifying leaseholders are protected by law from crippling bills for historical safety defects. As the Prime Minister made clear in his speech in this House last week, we will take the necessary steps to speed this up. We are willing to force freeholders to assess their buildings and enter remediation schemes within set timetables, with a legal requirement to force action, if that is what it takes to tackle industry intransigence. And we will set out further steps, as I mentioned, on remediation this autumn.
Would my honourable member give way?
I give way.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you very much, and I welcome her to her new position, and I know she'll be a firm advocate to those thousands and thousands of people who are waiting still for the remediation to be done on their buildings. While we need to have partnerships with the big housing builders in order to meet our target of 1.5 million, some of these same developers are the ones that are still dragging their feet on actually doing the remediation in the homes. Can she assure residents in my constituency and across the country that as part of the deal that they may be doing with other parts of her department, there will be part of those discussions are as well taking their responsibilities seriously in remediating the buildings in which they have responsibility for?
Minister. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for making that very important point. We already have a number of developers who've signed an agreement on the remediation agenda, and the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister have made very clear, as the entire government, that the commitment to house building, of the 1.5 million homes, these are two sides of the same coin. We have to make sure those buildings that are not safe are made safe, and we have to make sure the future homes that we build are safe and secure and address the needs of our country. So these are very important points that she makes, and we are very much on the same page. Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no excuse for a building owner to not enter a cladding scheme that they are eligible for. Yeah. Any owners who fail to do so will be held to account. We will not sit by while they fail to act. And as well as acting now to keep people safe, we are learning the lessons from Grenfell for the long term. We are investing in and supporting local resilience to deliver strong planning, response and recovery. The Department has provided £22.5 million in core capacity and capability funding to local resilience forums since 2021. These are of fundamental importance to our national resilience, and the Department will continue to consider every opportunity for further strengthening them, including by supporting the Cabinet Office to shape and develop the programme of engagement with local stakeholders through the Resilience Review. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will ensure robust oversight, strong regulatory frameworks and an unwavering commitment to accountability at every level. That means reforming the construction products industry that made this fatal cladding. Those who compromise that safety will face the consequences. It means taking steps to make the necessary improvements. In my written statement last week, Madam Deputy Speaker, we focused on improving the fire safety years after that report was published. The Home Office will bring forward proposals this autumn for residential personal emergency evacuation plans, or residential PEEPs as they're known. Residents with disabilities and impairments whose ability to evacuate could be compromised will be entitled to a person-centred risk assessment. This will identify appropriate equipment and adjustments supporting their fire safety or evacuation, as well as a residential PEEP statement, which records what they should do in the event of a fire. And we're getting this important work going by funding social housing providers to deliver residential PEEPs for their renters. The government will be engaged with representative groups as these plans are developed. The Home Office plans to lay regulations as soon as possible with a view to the proposals coming into force in 2025-26. In addition, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've made progress on delivering sounders, evacuation alert systems for new buildings to reduce the likelihood and impact of future fires, as recommended in Phase 1 of the Grenfell Inquiry report. And we will consider recommendations from Phase 2 regarding construction products shortly, as I mentioned. As this House is aware, we have also announced a withdrawal of the outdated national classes for fire testing standards in favour of the more robust European standards. And we will update approved document B to make provision for sprinklers in new care homes. Last week, we also announced a further £2 million in grant funding to reopen the Waking Watch Replacement Fund and support more residents in buildings with fire safety defects to put in place common alarm systems to help them keep residents safe. I give way to the Honourable.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for giving way. The Minister has talked about support available for high-rise buildings. In my constituency, my local authority has removed cladding from several council blocks, including one I grew up in, that are 4 stories or less. What support will the government be able to give, and what checks will the government be doing on lower-rise blocks?
Minister. I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. The evidence shows that the risks tend to be in the higher rise, and that's been the focus. But there are arrangements to make sure that lower rise buildings that have safety issues are also addressed. We need to look at these issues in the round. It's really important that we are not missing anything, but in terms of the work that the department's done so far, the bigger risks are in the higher rise. But I take his point, and where there are issues with lower rise buildings, we are very much willing to look at how we support those buildings. I give way to my...
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for being so generous in giving way to members across the House. Earlier in her remarks, and she just touched on it again, there is an issue where sometimes there are recalcitrant developers who are really reluctant to pay and not engaging with residents. There is a danger that those residents will be left right at the bottom of the heap as they compete for skills, products and so on to do this. I'm sure she is mindful of this, but is she able to give those residents any comfort about what pressure the government can put on these recalcitrant developers to help get on with the work and then make them pay later?
I thank my honourable friend. Having dealt with cases that she's referring to in my own constituency, I'm very aware of the challenges. As the Prime Minister has made clear in his response, if there is a need for further action, we will take further action. But we will use the existing laws and powers we have to take action now. I want to assure her that there are officials working closely with members of Parliament to support them and their constituents to ensure that action is taken. And I hope that I can meet with colleagues regularly in supporting them with officials in terms of working to make sure work is done by those who are required to and who are being intransigent. We will take action and we will work with you in making sure that you get the support you need. Madam Deputy Speaker, in response to the recent fires in Slough and Dagenham, the government is supporting local teams who are working to assist those affected. Firefighters also attended to a fire in my own borough, a high-rise building in Blackwall. I'm very grateful to the emergency staff for their bravery and quick response to these and other incidents. And following on from the fire in Dagenham, at a roundtable of regulators and partners, the Deputy Prime Minister made clear fixing unsafe buildings must happen faster. I know members across the House will share our resolve in wanting to see that the findings of the Grenfell inquiry are a catalyst for change. I want to assure the House that we will be holding a further debate on the Grenfell inquiry report in the autumn, which I know many members will want to contribute to. It will be an opportunity for members to share their insights and to discuss the specific recommendations that have been made and work with us to bring about the change that is urgently needed. In the meantime, we will support the Metropolitan Police and the Crown Prosecution Service as they complete their investigations to bring prosecutions. This is about delivering justice and accountability. But it's also about treating everyone, regardless of where they live, with respect. In that spirit, we're listening to those affected. We are engaging with residents, local authorities, housing associations and others in the fire safety community to ensure our policies and actions reflect the concerns of those affected. We're setting an expectation of industry to make sure that residents are listened to, protected and have peace of mind that action to make their homes safe is taken as a matter of priority and taken seriously. And looking to the future, Madam Deputy Speaker, we're going to ensure the security, health and well-being of residents and their wider communities will drive our mission to build 1.5 million new homes over this Parliament. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will never forget the Grenfell Tower tragedy on that night in June 2017. Over the past 7 years, the bereaved, survivors and immediate Grenfell community, despite their personal loss and pain, have campaigned relentlessly to protect their fellow citizens. As the Prime Minister said in the memory of Grenfell, we will change our country and we will bring the full power of government to bear on this task, because that is the responsibility of service. and the duty we owe to the memory of every single one of the 72 lives lost.
The question is that this House has considered building safety and resilience. I call the Shadow Minister, David Simmons.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to open by sharing His Majesty's official opposition's commitment to support the government in ensuring that, in particular, the legislation that was brought forward in the last Parliament, broadly with cross-party support to address the issues that she and colleagues have outlined following the Grenfell fire, are put forward and take full effect through regulation and implementation across the sector. It's absolutely clear, as was stated by the Leader of the Opposition during the Prime Minister's statement last week, that we share the government's determination to ensure that everybody in our country is able to feel safe in their home and to know that risks, whether those were known risks or those that may emerge from the continuing research into this field, that those risks are properly addressed. And we will do our very best to work with her and colleagues in a constructive manner to ensure that that happens. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, today's debate is also an opportunity to consider many of the broader issues around building safety that will come into play as we go forward to consider the government's plans to look at reform of our planning system, to increase our housing supply, to bring in new forms of building into the United Kingdom, and to consider the reform of building regulations. And a great deal of the report from Sir Martin into the Grenfell incident focuses on the role that building regulations and their operation in the market for materials, the market for design, played in the terrible disaster that then took the lives of 72 people. But we should not waste an opportunity to consider more broadly how other parts of our housing system and our planning system can ensure that such risks that might emerge in the future are dealt with effectively. For example, one of the things that we are aware of is that when a planning application comes forward, the safety and resilience of a building is not simply down to its own construction and materials, but its location, its proximity to other sources of risk, the design of the building from its very inception, all have a part to play in that. And when we consider some of the points which have been made by members across the House in the past about the role that housing plays in the context of public health, we know that in the capital, for example, poor air quality is often worse indoors than it is outdoors as a result of building design with poor ventilation, poor mechanical systems, all of which create a long-term health and safety burden for residents, which can be alleviated by giving due consideration to better design and resilience at the initial stages. I'd also, Madam Deputy Speaker, encourage the government to consider, as it embarks on this process, how to manage some of the very complex interactions that we see when seeking to improve the safety of buildings, where there are freeholders, there are leaseholders, and there are tenants, all occupying some of the same space. Now, I'm aware from my own experience in a local authority that Hillingdon had to go to court on 16 occasions to gain access to council properties to undertake basic maintenance and servicing work to installations against the will of the occupier, even though that work was being carried out at no cost to the tenant, which demonstrates some of the practical difficulties that this complex relationship can create in ensuring that local authorities and others are able to fulfil the duties that this House and this legislation places upon them. It's also clear from both the Grenfell report and other research that's been done that the drive towards building efficiency, in particular in respect of energy efficiency, has created a risk of a loss of focus on safety. And we know that that's been part of a global move to recognise the need to address climate change through better quality insulation and also to ensure the more efficient construction of buildings. So we see increasingly buildings being brought forward of a modular construction of different types. We've seen hotels that arrive with all of the rooms pre-constructed in a shipping crate that are simply stacked up and then provided with a brick skin. We are seeing frame constructed homes being a significant part of the delivery of the housing market. And all of these do create an opportunity to make the available funds go further in creating more homes more quickly, and that is extremely welcome. But we also need to ensure that the potential risks that might be associated with some of those forms of construction, especially where those take place at scale, are properly considered. I'd like to hear perhaps a little more from the government in due course about how the broader context of building safety and resilience will take those matters into account. Of course.
Would the Shadow Minister like to reflect that I think the government set up a committee to look at modern methods of construction around 4 years ago. Last investigation showed it hadn't actually met. It is important we get this right. We can see the problems of timber-framed homes and the difficulties that caused in the 1980s. So important that we get the techniques and construction right. But there was a bit of a gap in the last government's approach to this, wasn't there?
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, of course, it's embarrassing to hear that. I know, again, from experience in local government, a great deal of work has been put in to ensuring that modern methods of construction, often where we have exemplars around the country of how new estates, new homes have been delivered through that, are put forward for government consideration. So there's certainly no lack of evidence around the opportunities that are there. And it's also an opportunity to reflect that many of the challenges which we see, particularly in our current housing stock, and other types of buildings like schools and hospitals with aerated concrete and asbestos, that once upon a time those were wonder materials, that house builders and governments would have been considered inefficient if they hadn't brought those things forward and ensured that those were being used, and where we now know that those have created problems and risks that are requiring significant levels of expenditure to remediate. And that brings me on to another important point, which is, of course, that building resilience is not just about homes. The BBC recently did an excellent piece of work commemorating the original Health and Safety at Work Act, which was implemented by government following a number of quite appalling incidents that took place, mainly in factories where significant loss of life occurred because the design of those buildings meant, for example, in the event of a fire, that it was difficult or impossible for people to get away. We know, in respect of the total loss fires that have occurred, that we've seen school buildings that have been destroyed, and that thus far there's not been a single school fitted with sprinklers where a fire has occurred, where a total loss of that building has taken place. And the cost of installing that equipment at the design and construction stage is relatively modest compared with the impact of retrofitting it later. So there is an opportunity for government to reflect how, as we take forward things like the investment in new schools and the government's strategy around that we ensure that that resilience as far as possible is built in, and that the full cost to the taxpayer that occurs when a hospital or a school is lost is considered, and also how that we ensure that things like office buildings and factories that may be under construction also meet the highest possible standards that we can achieve, especially as they are often facing many of the same challenges around new materials, new forms of design, is tended to make them more efficient, but potentially bringing in risks which it is our duty to foresee and to prevent as far as we possibly can. I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, will shortly be seeing the introduction of the Renters Reform Bill, and that will have a wider impact, especially on the build-to-rent sector, where we've seen new forms of developer coming into the market, specifically intending to construct property that from its very start is there for the purpose of being a long-term rental home. Of course.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Shadow Minister's comments about working cross-party. One of the things I do think we need to do is establish the facts in what is actually the reality of going on and the confusion left by the previous government, where people are being told by mortgage providers they need an EWS1, but they're being told by the freeholders that they don't, and are stuck back and forth for years now. Would the Shadow Minister like to take this opportunity to recognise the confusing legacy left by his government and apologise to all those thousands of people that are stuck in places without a feeling like they have a place to go?
Well, thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think, especially given the broad cross-party consensus in the last Parliament about the importance of those new forms of legislation and the regulation that will follow from them, that we should seek to maintain that consensus as far as possible. But I have to say, as somebody who in a previous life worked in banking and was involved as a mortgage advisor, the challenges around the mortgageability of properties, especially properties of novel construction, are ones that go back many, many decades. In fact, if you're looking at properties that are located above shops, there are a very limited number of lenders out there that will provide for that because of particular sets of risks that go around that. And EWS1 was one of the examples where there clearly was a lot of debate despite apparent clarity from government within the sector, where some lenders preferred to go belt and braces and demand the provision of something which was not required by the law or the regulations before making a lending decision. And I know government did significant work to try and bring that clarity to address those problems in the previous Parliament. But it's a helpful introduction to a point which I do briefly want to touch on, and that is the role of the insurance industry within both the challenges that will follow on from Grenfell, but also the wider experience of many of our constituents who find themselves significantly challenged because, due to either a lack of clarity or uncertainty about the construction of their building, they face very significant insurance costs, sometimes to the point where there is only one insurance provider available, or where they're expected to face very significantly increased costs because of the behaviour of a landlord who seeks to apportion those insurance costs across all the properties in their portfolio, rather than do that according to the risks of the specific property that that tenant or leaseholder inhabits. And it will be helpful for government to give some consideration to how it can work with the insurance industry to ensure that those who are paying for insurance are paying a fair price, and that it provides the necessary cover that mortgage lenders, for example, will expect to find. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in closing this start of this debate, it's very clear that, as well as the strong commitment that we can give on this side of the House to support the government and the Minister in taking forward these regulations and making sure that they address the concerns that have been expressed, that we also make the most of an opportunity to consider the wider issues of building safety. We know that in London, for example, there are significant numbers of the bison blocks constructed with pre-stressed concrete, again at the time a wonder material, a means of delivering significant numbers of new homes efficiently and at a low cost, but which have particular sets of structural risks around them, which local authorities across the capital and across the wider country have had to address. We heard a little bit about the role of the fire service in carrying out inspections and prosecutions where properties are found not to meet fire regulations. All of these are indicators of risk across the system, and there is an opportunity for government to ensure that ministers have a clear line of sight so those indicators of risk can be effectively addressed. And if there is a role that we as politicians play, both in local government and also here in Westminster, it's that our job is to make sure that all these other people are doing their job. I can promise that the opposition will support the government in seeking to achieve that, and I hope we'll be able to take that forward, that work together effectively, so all of our constituents can sleep safely in their beds.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I first of all welcome my honourable friend to her position as Minister. As my honourable friend, the member for Hackney, said in an intervention a few moments ago, it is probably one of the most challenging and difficult jobs in government. We can all see the struggles that ministers across the from the other party, when government had to deal with this issue over many years. Indeed, are still struggling because we haven't got to the position we'd all like to be in. I want to comment on the many reports which the Select Committee did in the last Parliament and the one before. I was privileged to be chair of the Select Committee then. We produced 2 reports after Grenfell, following Dame Judith Hackett's initial report to government on the issues involved. We did pre-let scrutiny of the Building Safety Bill, followed it up with a report afterwards, and have done quite a lot of other work on things like construction products, and have had correspondence with ministers about those as well. But I say every one of the reports we did was agreed unanimously by the committee. It was cross-party, and I'm pleased that the way that the opposition spokesperson today has indicated their support for the general approach on these matters. We all want to see building safety carried out on all the buildings in our constituencies in a timely and proper manner. Dame Judith, in her report, and it struck me the more I was looking back at what I should say today, and just pick out 1 or 2 bits of what we did on the Select Committee, was her comments not just about what was needed to be done about building regulations, and the Grenfell report clearly sets out there needs to be an overall comprehensive review to avoid the gaps in regulations that do exist. That's absolutely right, and the government will no doubt be following that through and reporting on what they're going to do eventually. But what she said was it wasn't just a matter of rules and regulations, it was about culture. There's an issue of culture in the building industry, which is about a race to the bottom. How cheaply can you do things? And that's shown in Grenfell when you can see examples of products being substituted for other products because the substitutes were cheaper. So in the end, the safety of individuals was put behind financial returns. And unfortunately, that's just far too common in the construction industry. And it is a fundamental reform to attitudes and culture that is needed, that the Minister, I think, may struggle to do more than even the review of building regulations, which will be a struggle enough of itself. So certainly that's got to be borne in mind right the way through. But we look forward, nevertheless, to the Government's response to all the recommendations of Sir Martin Morblick and his inquiry in terms of what they're actually going to do, because it is truly shocking, and the figures the Minister gave to me in a written answer the other day about the around 4,000 homes that still got this dangerous cladding on them. It really is quite shocking after all this time. I just say, I wonder whether the Minister might like to consider updating that figure regularly, maybe 3 months in the library, so we can all look at whether progress has been made, whether it's been made quickly enough, whether she'd even like to provide a list of all the buildings, their owners and their developers, so we can start to see where the guilty parties are. There are some with legitimate reasons that we want to know, but others simply are not interested in getting on with the work which is their responsibility. But there are some problems and some challenges which the Minister might also like to address. And one of them, my attention was drawn to a particular block where they could get access to the Building Safety Fund for removal of cladding, but other safety work that needed to be done, like missing firewalls and dangerous fire doors and all those sorts of things, they couldn't get funding for that from the Building Safety Fund. Now, where there are developers involved, and you should be going to developers and pushing them to put right their wrongs of their construction, that's okay. But when this case, the developer had gone bust, and the building was actually owned by its leaseholders, where did they go in that situation? Well, actually what happened was the building work just stopped. So there are situations around where, because we ended up not with a comprehensive building safety fund, which the Select Committee recommended to cover all aspects of building safety work, but just cladding, because there are other elements of building safety which are not covered by the Building Safety Fund, you can get to these situations where buildings are left unsafe. And there's no one really you can point the finger at and say they are responsible. So I hope the Minister might think about it. She probably can't give an answer today, but there are other issues around. And if we could start to identify precisely where the buildings are, many more of those types of buildings may come out of that process. So the other issue is it's about where there are recalcitrant developers and owners, how can the leaseholders in those buildings get help? They're often faced with the costs that's all been referred to, the high insurance costs. They're faced with enormous worry about what happens to their life next. And we talked to people on the Select Committee who were just in despair. And that was a few years ago. They're probably still in despair now because nothing's moved in their situation. But then on top of that, they can be faced with legal costs to challenge the developers and the owners. Can the Minister give some assurance that her department, her officials, will stand ready to offer all assistance possible to leaseholders in that situation who are really struggling, really desperate in many circumstances? I know the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership's done good work in providing assistance, but the technical advice, the legal advice, could be really coming from her department on these matters. Just one or two other key issues, and I can't go through all the issues of building safety that came up at the Select Committee. I'll be here for a lot longer than the debate today. What I would say is skills. The skills were referred to. We called in one of our recommendations on looking at the building safety bill for a national system of third-party accreditation and registration for all professionals working on the design and construction of high-rise buildings. Now, it doesn't include all the people who work on it in terms of labourers and other skills, but nevertheless, all those involved with professional skills, whether it be at one level architects, others overseeing construction work, or actually building safety managers, all should be properly accredited. And there ought to be a national system. And it's clear there are gaps in that. But down to the people who work on the trades, it is still a disgrace that under building safety regulations for electrical safety, The only rules are about competent persons. So looking at higher-rise buildings, if you have an electrician come and do work in your kitchen where there's water, or outside in your garden where there's water, they're not covered by any building safety regulations. If they come and work in your bathroom, they are, except they have to be part of a competent person scheme. But the competent person scheme doesn't mean that the person doing the work has to be competent. It simply means that the company has to be registered as having someone in it who is competent, who can sign off the work at the end of the day, even if they never see the work that's done. Now, the committee reported on that several times back in 2015 and never got any further with it. So there's something to look at there. Just finally, one or two other issues. Construction products, that was clearly a problem at Grenfell. Welcome the comments in the Grenfell report on that. We called over and over again for a comprehensive review of product testing and their safety. What we called for was a publication, not merely of the products that have been tested and found to be safe, but where they failed. Because what Dame Julie Hackett found initially in her review was that there were companies going around with their products from one testing house to another until they find one that passed them. But the failures were never notified to anybody. That can't be right. Now, Sir Martin Morblick's called for more transparency about product testing. Can we ensure that element of it, that transparency of results, the failures as well as the successes, is reported as well? In all the costs of Grenfell, developers are being held to account to some degree. Not one construction product manufacturer has been asked to pay a single penny towards the cost of building remediation. Yet we know that many of them are clearly responsible for some of the problems. Why? We've pushed government on this. We last wrote to the Minister, I think, in March of last year about it. The government commissioned a report by Paul Morell on construction products and safety. The government's not responded. The last government never responded in detail to that report. So will the Minister now look at that report and give a response to it, look both at the testing, at the categorisation of products, and also how construction product manufacturers can be made to pay some of the costs that shouldn't fall on leaseholders and shouldn't fall on social housing providers. Just 2 more points, Madam Deputy Speaker. Building control. Really pleased at the recommendations in the Grenfell report that building control should always be appointed by an independent third party. The developer shouldn't be choosing their own friends in some cases to go on and sign off a building. Now, for the very high-rise building, the building safety regulator now is responsible for appointing building control officers. Yes, I will.
Thank you for giving way, and I compliment him on all the work he's done on this. Does he think one of the problems is the systemic underfunding of local authorities, inadequacy of all of their inspection regimes, and particular building control, which has had such a devastating effect on the quality of building in so many areas of the country?
Thank the honourable gentleman for that comment, and yes, I do. And the committee's made many recommendations and many reports about the whole issue of local authority funding and how there's been squeezed resources on those sorts of services, given the priority local authorities have to give to social care in all its forms and now temporary accommodation. Yes, absolutely agree on that. But in the end, I think there is, as well as resources, the question of independence. Is the building control officer who goes there beholden in any way to the developer, whoever the developer is, on the basis, well, if you don't give me a difficult time on this building, I won't give you any work for the next one. That is something that has to be stopped. Now, the government, I say, has done that for the highest-rise building, the last government, but we need to stop it for all buildings. And I'm pleased at Sir Martin's report. Finally, I will return to the issue of social housing. I'm not allowed to go away, Minister, I'm sorry. The Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister both made their comments about the discrimination and back treatment of social housing tenants. For a long time, we've had the attitude that this is poor housing for poor people and they don't really matter. We've got to actually challenge that. They do matter. And of course, the landlords of the social housing sector, housing associations and councils will always do their best to try and make buildings safe. And that will mean, in some cases, because there isn't access to the Building Safety Fund, unless they can show they can't do the work, which they can always find some money to do it, will mean it squeezes the headroom in the HRA or housing associations' business plans. And that squeezed headroom is headroom that otherwise would be made available to build new homes. And if the government wants to build 1.5 million new homes, and I fully support that, I think it's one of the best commitments this government is making, but it will not be built by the private sector alone. They're going to have to be quite a substantial number of social houses built. And that means resources in the HRAs and resources in housing associations' business plans. And the more we squeeze them with other responsibilities that aren't funded by the Building Safety Fund, then the less money will be available to build new social housing. I will. The final stuff. Okay.
Yes. So, thank you for raising the point of the impact on the HRA. We had two such buildings that were dealt with compartmentalisation, had no support from the government, and had to rehouse 300 families in just under a year, as per best practice. Do you agree with me that the pressure on councils was much greater than it has been on private developers to move quickly on remediation and removal in this issue?
Yes, and I hope that...
Need to be reminded that contributions are made through the chair, so making eye contact with the chair is most important, not with the minister on the front bench.
Chair, I'd always want to make eye contact with you. I'm sure you appreciate that. No, I'm probably not get called again for a long time. That's but, yes, of course, I agree that social landlords in particular should take their responsibilities seriously. I think most of them do, but many of them are struggling. So my final ask of the Minister is, this is an urgent issue. Would she agree to meet with me and Kate Henderson, the Chief Executive of the National Housing Federation, together with the representative of local council, who've done an excellent report recently about funding for council house building, to discuss this issue and the extra challenges it poses to both housing associations and councils at this difficult time. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to conclude my comments there. I want to thank all my colleagues who were involved in the Select Committee in the previous two parliaments. There'll be a new chair elected today. I just offer my help and assistance in any way I can, two excellent candidates, whoever's the chair, to support them going forward, because this issue is going to be one I'm sure the new Select Committee will want to address.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Marie Goldman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to welcome and congratulate the Minister to her position and please see her in her place. As Liberal Democrats, as we have already said in this chamber, we welcome the Grenfell Tower Inquiry final report. And we would like to put on record again to thank the families of the victims and, of course, the survivors for giving their testimony and their and their statements to that inquiry. And we know how difficult that will have been. A lot has been said in this chamber already today about the issue of cladding. And I'm not going to say anything about cladding. I'm going to remind this chamber that, as some honourable members have said, that it's not just about cladding, that there are other many safety issues, fire safety issues in buildings that need to be remediated, and this is a debate about building safety. And we must discuss other things than just the remediation of cladding. So I just want to draw some more attention to that. I'd like to use an example from my own constituency of Chelmsford, where I am aware that there are various fire safety issues going on in various different buildings around the constituency. In particular, something that I'm sure that other members will see in their inbox, and that's the issue of fire doors that need to be remediated. So fire doors that maybe have been either inadequate when they were installed in the first place or were in fact installed incorrectly. And that's something that does need to be fixed. But the developers, the building owners, and through them their management companies are not taking responsibility for fixing those issues and are indeed trying to pass the buck and are trying to make the leaseholders and the tenants pay for the replacement of those doors where is necessary, and saying and using the defects periods that may well have expired as an excuse for not taking up those issues and not paying for the remediation. Even in one instance in my constituency where I know that one of the leaseholders actually commissioned a survey prior to the expiration of the defects period, which identified that there were problems with the fire doors, but the developer is still trying to say that no, they're not responsible for replacing all of the fire doors in that building, even though they were of identical design, and they accept that they have responsibility for, as I understand it, for those particular doors. And this is an example of where the construction industry, unfortunately, is not taking responsibility for the issues that they have created, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And there are other fire safety issues which we will all have seen in our inboxes. Now, some of them will be things that are what we describe in the construction industry, and I say we because I have worked in the construction industry for many years, what we describe as patent defects, so defects that we can see, that if you walk up to something, you can see that it doesn't work. But there are many, many latent defects which are hidden in the depths of the building, which cannot be seen by the naked eye, which come out much, much later on. And we need to provide a way of making sure that we help leaseholders with not having to shoulder the burden, the financial burden of rectifying those defects when they come out, because some of them are they're fundamental to the building. So defects such as safety issues around gas pipes that have been incorrectly installed, and it's come out later on that there is inadequate shielding around those pipes, as is happening, as I understand, in a building in my constituency of Chelmsford. And I could go on and on about other fire safety issues, and I won't, because I know that other honourable members want to speak, and I have quite a few things I still like to say. But there is a huge backlog of issues that need to be remedied, and the Minister talked about the number of buildings that are on the register or on the list of buildings that need to be remediated. What I would say is that having spoken to a fire safety expert from a local authority, not in my constituency, who is responsible for looking at all of the buildings within that local authority's housing stock, they had to put together a report which had to be submitted by the deadline, which I believe was earlier this year. When they submitted it, or tried to submit it to the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, the Health and Safety Executive said, whoa, hang on, don't submit it now, we can't cope. We'll let you know when we want to receive those documents. It may well not be until 2029. So the number of buildings that the Minister was talking about, I would say, is definitely an underestimate of what will eventually be the final number. And I would urge the Minister to discuss this issue with the Health and Safety Executive to see what other resources they might need to be able to move more quickly with that. Because let's remember that people are living in these buildings, and they are living in buildings where they have been told officially that they are not safe. And so every single night they go to bed knowing that they are sleeping, and their families are sleeping, their children are sleeping in buildings that are not safe. So we don't know the full extent of the problem. And there are many, many recommendations that can come out. But one of the things that really strikes me, and we could talk about how the construction industry operates, etc., but let's talk very briefly about the planning system. It strikes me as very strange that the fire service are still not statutory consultees on planning applications for buildings over 18 metres, buildings that are high-rise buildings. That seems very strange to me when we're talking about fire safety, and of course the fire service are experts in fire safety, and yet we don't make them statutory consultees. That feels very strange to me and feels quite a big oversight, and something that I would urge the Minister to look into. There was talk earlier about historical issues and how we need to remedy them. I would just like to highlight to the Minister and to everyone here that these issues are not just historical. There are buildings that I'm aware of that are less than 2 years old that have fire compartmentation problems, that have missing fire stopping. This is something that is ongoing. And as one fire safety expert put it to me, after everything that happened with Grenfell, developers are still getting away with it. So it is a systemic problem, and there are many, many reasons for it. It's partly driven by finances, it's partly driven by many, many things. But as the Honourable Member for Sheffield South East said, it is also a cultural problem. There is a lot that we need to work on with that. Now, I will now just very briefly admit to a slightly guilty pleasure, which is that I quite like watching the programme Air Crash Investigation. Now, it might seem a bit macabre, but I quite like how the airline industry... Now, the airline industry is not perfect, and I do not want to give the impression the airline industry is perfect, so anyone from the airline industry, I'm going to big you up a little bit, but I don't think the airline industry is perfect. But how they investigate issues that have happened, how they investigate crashes, and how they work out what went wrong, and then do not point the finger of blame, no matter where the fault lies. They look at how they could have avoided it and how they can make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. If only we could make the construction industry do the same and change that culture, rather than trying to have the slippery shoulders, well, it's not my fault, well, it was that subby, or it was this subcontractor over there, oh, well, it was, it was the manufacturer, whatever. Having worked in the construction industry for a long time, I know that that does happen a lot. If we could change the culture to be something more like how the airline industry investigates problems, I would be very happy to see that. But then also there was another industry that I think we could learn something from in the construction industry, and that is when we see something, I've just mentioned, issues with fire safety issues, things that need to be remediated. If we think about if something goes wrong, how many of you, I'm sure very many people in this chamber have had cars where they've had a recall notice, a safety recall notice issued to them. And that means that the motor industry and the manufacturers have to recall those cars, and they fix the issues, the safety issues. If it was something to do with the brakes, or if it was something to do with anything in the engine that is a safety issue, they recall it and they fix it at their expense. I would like to see something similar happen in the construction industry, where people take much more responsibility for it. But I'd just like to bring this back to leaseholders, because it is incredibly important that we remember the implications of all of the delay that is happening when things are not being fixed on leaseholders. Not only is it a fire risk, as I mentioned before, we have people who are on 24-hour watch. Other members have mentioned the difficulty in getting mortgages. Many leaseholders cannot sell their properties at the moment. They cannot move on. I think this has implications for the housing crisis as well, because it means that there is less churn in the housing industry. It means that fewer people are able to move out of those flats and allow other people to move into them. It is exacerbating the crisis, and of course other people have mentioned insurance. I am also concerned, as other honourable members have mentioned, that social landlords are not eligible for government funds to remediate buildings, leaving many of the most vulnerable at risk. And I would urge the government and the Minister to listen to the National Housing Federation, who represent hundreds of housing associations, and also the End Our Cladding scandal campaigns on these issues. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to reiterate Liberal Democrat policy on this. I'd just like to remind that the Liberal Democrats have been calling for the removal of dangerous cladding from all buildings, but making sure that leaseholders don't have to pay for it. And just to reiterate what I said earlier, that it shouldn't just be about cladding. There are other things which are really serious as well. Fire stopping in particular, fire doors are incredibly important. So, as my honourable friend from St Albans asked the Prime Minister to do just last week, we need the government to step in and put the cash in up front to carry out the remediation in some circumstances, and then the government should go after those who are responsible, and that would alleviate a lot of suffering. And very, very finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would just like to say that fire safety isn't a luxury. It should be seen as a right. Thank you.
Joe Powell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start just by putting on record the thanks of my constituents in Kensington and Bayswater, obviously inclusive of the wider Grenfell community, for the support across the House last week when the Grenfell Inquiry Stage 2 was launched, for the Minister and the Government for making time today and for committing to future time, and also for the Prime Minister for his statement and his heartfelt apology on behalf of the British state for what happened. I think he spoke for us all, including the Leader of the Opposition in that debate. The Grenfell legacy obviously has lots of dimensions, but one of them is building safety. So again, I would urge members to again remember that 72 victims from that fire, whose legacy has to be partly fixing this crisis. After the report, there were kind of 3 immediate actions that the community were looking to me to advocate for in this place. Criminal prosecutions, of course, is not a matter, as you said, for discussion today, but it is important, as the Minister of Justice mentioned yesterday in questions, that we ensure that the court system is prepared for any potential decisions that come through the Metropolitan Police and CPS process, and ensure that court backlogs and the complexity of any potential trials don't result in even further delays in justice. Secondly, the accountability of the companies themselves is not just about criminal investigations, it's also about their role in terms of public procurement, paying for remedial work, and so on. So we need to continue to push on that. And finally, the policy changes that we are discussing today to ensure this never happens again, because, as others have said, the pace of change has been far too slow. And that pace of change is partly, as my right honourable friend from Sheffield South East said, the culture around, in particular, social housing tenants and how they're treated and their agency and power and respect, but also the tens of thousands of people up and down the country who are still going to bed in buildings that are unsafe. In my constituency, quite incredibly, given the history of Grenfell, we have one of those buildings that is not yet on the department's list because they went under a fire inspection just a few months ago, and flammable rendering was found. And I think it's a good example of what many members have already mentioned. It's a building that has approximately 50% social tenants and 50% shared ownership leaseholders who have scraped together the money to get on the housing ladder and have now been hit with a £400 a month increase in their service charge, primarily driven by the dramatic increase in insurance after the fire inspection took place. So I agree with the Shadow Minister and his call to look at the insurance market, because in this case there was not a competitive bid for insuring this building. I know there has been a discussion with the Association of British Insurers to see how we can bring down the costs, but I'd really urge the government to look at that, because in the short term, while we wait for the remedial work to take place, that is simply unaffordable for those leaseholders. So I certainly think the insurance industry is something we need to look at. In addition, this building is another example of this merry-go-round of buck passing that we talked about last week between local government, national government, developers, freeholders, housing associations. So we need clear timelines to speed this up, and I really welcome the Prime Minister's commitment on that, and incentives, I think, in the system, carrots and sticks, to make sure that we don't have this kind of never-ending situation where leaseholders and tenants are unclear about when the work will be done. And as the Minister said, the money is there, so it's about knocking heads together and making sure that at an individual building level we get the speeding up that we need. And I will be writing to her about this specific building that I've mentioned. Speeding up this work is obviously part of the answer, but there are recommendations now from Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry that are obviously also relevant beyond cladding itself, as the Honourable Lady mentioned. So I really welcome the announcement last week from the government that residential personalised emergency evacuation plans for disabled people will be taken forward. I know it was a big frustration of many of my constituents that had not happened under the previous government. So we look forward to more detail around what those PEEPs will look like. And I would urge the government in the comprehensive spending review to look at funding for multiple years for implementing that for social landlords, and a scheme to make sure that developers and freeholders will cover the costs for private buildings too. I think we're all still digesting the full Phase 2 report, and there will be time to go into that in more detail. But I think one recommendation that I would urge the government to think about straight away is the streamlining of accountability in terms of the ministerial responsibility and the regulator, so that we do not have a dispersed system between multiple departments that makes it very easy for things to fall through the cracks, as Sir Martin Morbick made clear in his report. So I hope we'll have time to discuss that in detail. And finally, in terms of who should pay, I really welcome the Prime Minister's statement that he will be writing to the companies and looking at exclusions in the public procurement process to ensure that companies referenced in the Grenfell report will not be able to access public tenders. And I would also want to put on record my thanks to golfer Shane Lowry, who yesterday, belatedly, but he got there in the end, removed the sponsorship from one of those companies mentioned, which I will not mention them by name, just out of caution. But more broadly, clearly these developers need to pay for the remedial work. So in closing, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the campaigners have done an incredible job, as the Minister said in her opening remarks. Their ask has always been for truth, which we have now from the inquiry, for justice that we hope will come from the criminal prosecution system, and for change, which is on all of us to deliver in this House. Thank you.
Maiden speech, Peter Fortune.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I say I've learnt from the potential misstep for the Honourable Member from Sheffield South East, and I promise to gaze at you throughout my entire speech. A maiden speech, Madam Deputy Speaker, is by tradition and design supposed to be quite light-hearted, and that is how I have fashioned this. But I want the House to be in no doubt that this is a very serious issue, and I welcome the cross-party conversation that's been had about the disaster at Grenfell. And I know that my constituents in Bromley and Biggin Hill send their thoughts and their prayers to the victims, survivors and their families, and for those that have been impacted elsewhere. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is obvious that I represent the finest constituency in all of this great United Kingdom. Before I set out my case, let me say a few words about my main predecessor, noting, of course, those communities we welcome from the constituencies of both Beckenham and Orpington. But the majority of my new constituency is inherited from Bromley and Chislehurst and Sir Bob Neal, KC. Sir Bob was and is a creature of this House, a magnificent speaker, bon vivant and good friend to many in this chamber. Bob dedicated his adult life to service. He started as a councillor before moving to the Greater London Council. The GLC, of course, met its demise in 1986. Bob, unperturbed, simply hung around till it was reinvented in 2000 when he became the first Assembly member for Bexley and Bromley. In 2006, with the passing of the much-loved awkward squad member Eric Forth, Bob fought a difficult by-election to become the member for Bromley and Chislehurst. For nearly a quarter of a century, Bob has been part of the fabric of our community, always ready to fight for those who needed a voice. Bob has a deep admiration and love for the law. Of the many positions he's held in politics, I believe it is chairman of the Justice Select Committee where he reached his pinnacle. His knowledge and depth of understanding has been of unquestionable benefit to the House, but his love of the law is trumped by a love that is much deeper. It's not West Ham, it's not opera, it's not even Gibraltar, to which I know he's given so much time. His greatest love is for Anne Louise, the woman, the wife, and the friend who's made him so happy. And members will know that fate took a particularly callous decision early on in their new relationship. But they will know that Bob and Anne Louise faced that challenge with their typical resilience and humour. I thank him for his service, for the graciousness and kindness with which he has always treated me, and I wish his family well. Yeah. Before I move on to making the self-evident case that Bromley and Biggin Hill is the greatest constituency that has ever existed ever, I want to make a note of another previous member for Bromley, the former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. As Minister for Housing, he took on the responsibility of meeting new and ambitious housing targets. He was not keen at first, writing in his diary in 1951 that it was not my cup of tea at all. Despite his concerns, he met the inflated target a year early and changed the lives of families right across the country by presenting the opportunity to live in a safe and secure home. I wonder how he would feel now, and this does link to the substance of the debate, that residents of North Point in Bromley are still suffering due to a cladding crisis that is of no fault of their own. This is an injustice that has gone on for too long, and it is vital that the whole House works together to free those impacted from the imposed shackles of poor governance and a lack of accountability. Before moving on to talk further about the constituency, I would like to say thank you to the best people I know. I cannot linger here for too long, otherwise I shall be reduced to an emotional puddle. But I must recognise my beautiful family, without whom I am nothing. My extraordinary children make me so proud, and I am blessed with the most beautiful, talented, funny, and patient wife in Anna Marie. She is the most wonderful and kindest person I have ever met. I will never be good enough for her, but I will keep trying. To business. Bromley and Biggin Hill is a long, thin, and elegant constituency.